It happens in a small moment you almost miss. A quiet conversation. A simple request. You say no, gently, and the temperature drops. Not loudly, not theatrically, just a clean withdrawal of warmth, like a switch flipped behind someone's eyes. You feel it in your body before you can name it. The pause that lasts half a beat too long. The expression that turns still. The sense that you're no longer talking to a person, but to a pattern that has learned how to wear one. That's the cost of misreading intent. Because when you mistake control for care, you hand over access. To your trust. To your identity. Sometimes to your safety. And by the time the mask cracks, you're often already inside the story they're writing for you. So in this long walk together, we're not chasing spectacle. We're tracing a lineage. How these traits survived. How they were described before we had clinical language. What neuroscience suggests about reward, planning, and emotional absence. And then, step by step, a ledger of 100 distinct manipulation techniques, mapped for recognition, not imitation. If you want a companion reference, there's a PDF in the description. Keep it nearby. We're going in.
Chapter 1: Survival Minds, the Evolutionary Fast Life Strategy. To understand why dark traits exist at all, we have to start before therapy offices, before courtrooms, before the modern self. We have to start with small groups trying to make it through bad weather, sickness, and hunger. In those conditions, cooperation is expensive. It costs time. It costs patience. It costs restraint. You share today so the group shares tomorrow. But tomorrow isn't promised. And when life feels short, when danger is common and resources swing between enough and nothing, a different strategy can look rational. Researchers in evolutionary psychology often describe this as a fast life strategy. Not fast in the sense of clever. Fast in the sense of urgent. You take what's available. You prioritize short-term gains. You invest less in long-term bonds because long-term bonds are fragile. In that frame, traits we now call narcissistic, Machiavellian, or psychopathic aren't evil genes. They're a cluster of tendencies that can pay off in unstable environments, at least for the individual expressing them. The thing is, these tendencies don't need to dominate a whole group to matter. They only need to exist often enough to exploit the group's default assumption that most people mean what they say. Consider what a cooperative group depends on. Memory. Reputation. Shared rules. If you hunt together, you have to believe someone won't run off with the meat. If you raise children in a network, you have to believe someone won't use access as leverage. Trust is the invisible infrastructure. A fast strategy person treats that infrastructure differently. Status isn't earned slowly through contribution, it's taken through display. Resources aren't shared to build mutual security, they're hoarded to create dependence. Mates aren't approached through stable attachment, they're pursued through opportunistic charm, pressure, and rapid escalation. It's not romantic. It's tactical. And this is where a hard truth enters. In the short term, these tactics can work. If you can lie without leaking stress, you can gain access. If you can imitate warmth without feeling it, you can move faster than someone who has to mean it. If you can shift blame without shame, you can survive consequences that would teach other people to stop. But groups aren't passive. Early human communities, like modern ones, developed ways to detect and manage rule testers. Not perfectly, but enough to keep the system from collapsing. The rule tester is the person who pushes small boundaries to see what moves. They borrow and return late. They tell a story with a few extra details that can't be checked. They flatter strategically, then withdraw it when you hesitate. They watch what you tolerate because tolerance is a map. In a small group, that kind of testing creates a specific problem. You can't simply exile every difficult person. Labor matters. Strength matters. Connections matter. And sometimes the rule tester is useful until they aren't. So groups often respond with informal containment. Gossip is one form of social immune system. Not glamorous, but effective. When people quietly share warnings, they reduce the rule tester's freedom to reinvent themselves with each new target. Reputation becomes offense. Another response is boundary ritual. Rules that look overly strict from the outside often evolve because they close loopholes. If food distribution is monitored, it's because someone once skimmed. If certain disputes must be witnessed, it's because someone once twisted a private conversation into a public accusation. When you don't have written records, you build customs that function like them. This is also where status dynamics get complicated. A charismatic rule tester can sometimes climb quickly because confidence reads like confidence. In harsh environments, certainty can feel soothing. And if someone is willing to make ruthless choices others won't make, they can look like a leader in a crisis. What nobody knows in the moment is whether that leadership is protection or predation. Because fast strategy behavior often disguises itself as strength. Narcissistic grandiosity can look like vision. Machiavellian calculation can look like wisdom. Psychopathic calm can look like courage. Yet the emotional signature underneath tends to be consistent. Relationships are instrumental. People are levers. If you're useful, you're close. If you're inconvenient, you're punished or discarded. And the group gradually learns that this person doesn't connect the way others do. A simple analogy helps here. Imagine a village building a well. Most people treat the well as shared survival. They protect it because everyone needs it. But a fast strategy person treats the well as a bargaining chip. They don't poison it, they still need water. They simply control access. They stand near it, keep track of who owes them, and trade water for obedience. That's the seed of something we'll follow across centuries. Because once humans formed hierarchies, courts, churches, armies, and bureaucracies, the well changed shape. It became information, money, legitimacy, love. And the same survival mind learned new costumes. In the next chapter, we'll see how ancient cultures tried to warn each other, using stories, myths, and moral language long before we had the terms to measure these traits at all.
Chapter 2. Ancient Warning Stories, Hubris, and the First Taxonomies. Before anyone had questionnaires or clinical language, people still had to solve the same problem. How do you describe someone who looks human, sounds human, plays the social game, but doesn't seem to carry the same internal brakes? Early cultures didn't start with definitions. They started with stories. Because a story can hold a warning without requiring proof. You don't have to win an argument. You just have to recognize the pattern when it walks into your life. Myths were a kind of social memory. Not science in the modern sense, but a way of labeling recurring dangers in the human psyche. A way of saying, we've seen this before, and it doesn't end well. In Greek literature, hubris isn't just arrogance. It's a specific kind of overreach, someone acting as if limits don't apply to them. And that detail matters, because hubris is less about confidence and more about entitlement. The person doesn't simply want success. They want exemption. The ancient warning is subtle. The hubristic figure often begins as impressive. They speak with certainty. They gather attention easily. Other people orbit them because humans are drawn to coherence, even when it's manufactured. But as the story moves forward, you see the tell. Admiration is never enough. The figure needs constant reflection, constant confirmation, constant proof that the world agrees with their self-image. That's one of the earliest cultural sketches of grandiosity, what we might now connect to narcissistic traits. Not vanity as a harmless quirk, but vanity as appetite. And appetite doesn't negotiate. It consumes. Meanwhile, many traditions carried a different kind of warning. The person who can do harm without remorse, and who remains strangely untouched by the emotional consequences that shape normal social life. In older folklore, this often gets framed as otherness, a being without a soul, a creature that wears a face, not because people were naive, but because they lacked a better vocabulary for low empathy and low guilt. If your neighbor can calmly destroy a family and then eat dinner as usual, you either admit that humans can be like that, or you place them outside the category of human. The story becomes a container for something terrifyingly real. And then there's the third thread, the strategist. Not the loud, grandiose figure. Not the openly predatory one. The person who studies the rules in order to bend them. Ancient epics and political dramas are full of these characters. Advisors who speak softly, who manipulate alliances, who understand that you don't have to win a battle if you can win the narrative around the battle. What's interesting is that these stories often treat cleverness with respect and suspicion at the same time. The strategist is useful to the tribe, right up until the moment you realize they aren't loyal to the tribe. They're loyal to their own position inside it. So even early on, we can see a kind of proto-taxonomy forming. Not a checklist, but an instinctive sorting of dangers, the grandiose, the callous, and the calculating. And this is where mythology does something psychologically important. It externalizes the cost. Because in real life, the cost of misreading intent isn't dramatic. It's slow. It's the way a community reorganizes itself around one person's moods. It's the way people start choosing words carefully, not out of respect, but out of fear of backlash. It's the way a family begins protecting secrets, not because secrets are sacred, but because truth has become dangerous. Ancient stories didn't always describe manipulation directly, but they described its gravitational effects. They showed what happens when one person's internal world becomes the center of everyone else's behavior. And they also offered early countermeasures. Not therapy, not boundaries as we talk about them now, but moral framing, public naming, ritual consequence. When a culture tells and retells a story about an entitled figure being brought down by their own overreach, it teaches a quiet lesson. Do not confuse status with virtue. When it tells stories about betrayal hidden inside charm, it teaches another one. Do not confuse warmth with conscience. When it tells stories about the clever advisor who sells loyalty for advantage, it teaches, do not confuse intelligence with integrity. Now, we should be careful. Myths aren't diagnostic tools. They blend psychology with religion, politics, and art. But they reveal something consistent across time. Humans have always noticed these patterns, even when they didn't agree on why they existed. And as societies became more complex, courts, assemblies, legal codes, those old warnings didn't disappear. They became more practical. They moved from gods and monsters into rhetoric, reputation, and social engineering. In the next chapter, we'll step into that shift, persuasion as a technology and the strategy of the lie.
Chapter 3: Classical Power, Rhetoric and the Strategy of the Lie. Classical societies didn't just build roads and laws. They built stages. Public life became performance, and performance became a tool that could move crowds, topple rivals, and protect reputations that didn't deserve protection. In Athens, rhetoric was treated like a kind of civic technology. If you could speak well, you could shape what people believed was true, or at least what they were willing to act on. And in Rome, where politics was inseparable from status, persuasion wasn't decoration. It was survival. The shift here is important. Myths warned you about monsters. Classical power taught you to fear something quieter, a person who looks reasonable while bending reality. Because once truth becomes negotiable in public, the lie doesn't need to be bold. It just needs to be plausible. It needs to fit the emotional needs of the listener. A skilled rhetorician learns early that most people don't decide based on evidence first. They decide based on belonging, pride, fear, and the need to feel consistent with who they think they are. So the lie gets built around identity. It doesn't say, here is what happened. It says, here is what someone like you would obviously believe. What we're watching emerge is the separation of objective truth from social influence. Not as an abstract theory, but as a lived practice. The courtroom, the Senate, the Assembly. These are arenas where the story can matter more than the facts, because the story controls the meaning of the facts. And meaning is where manipulation lives. Reputation, in this world, becomes a currency. Not your inner character, but your public image. And that invites a particular kind of person, someone who's willing to appear virtuous while acting opportunistically. There's a reason classical writers paid so much attention to honor, shame, and face. Those weren't just emotions. They were social technologies. If you could control the flow of honor and shame, you could control people without chaining them. You could make them self-police. So a manipulator doesn't always threaten you directly. They threaten your standing. They imply, carefully, that your refusal will make you look disloyal, ungrateful, or suspicious. And if your community depends on status for survival, that implication can feel like a knife at the throat. This is also where we start seeing early forms of triangulation, not as a modern relationship term, but as political structure. You don't fight your enemy head-on. You recruit their allies. You plant doubts. You use intermediaries so you can deny involvement. You let someone else deliver the message that wounds, so your hands stay clean. The target doesn't just lose an argument. They lose their social footing. Classical texts are full of accusations of betrayal, bribery, and moral corruption, but what's often more revealing is the method. The insinuation. The strategic leak. The half-truth delivered at the right moment when it can't be easily corrected. Once a rumor spreads through a forum or a banquet, you don't need it to be proven. You only need it to be remembered. And there's another detail that matters for our larger journey. Classical power sharpened the art of appearing calm. If you can stay composed while your opponent becomes reactive, you look credible. Even if you're the one provoking them. Even if you engineered the situation. This is an early blueprint of a tactic we'll later call reality control. You don't win by being right. You win by making the other person look unstable. Meanwhile, ordinary people watching these contests learn something too. They learn that sincerity can be exploited. They learn that a confident lie can outpace a careful truth. And in response, they begin to adapt. They become more cautious with trust, more attuned to subtext, more aware that a pleasant tone doesn't guarantee good intent. What's developing is a kind of cultural arms race. The better manipulation gets, the more detection becomes necessary. And the more detection spreads, the more sophisticated manipulation becomes. But there was one problem that never went away. No matter how refined rhetoric became, it still relied on an audience. It still relied on people wanting to believe. It still relied on social incentives that rewarded performance. So the person who treats others as levers doesn't need to be physically violent. They can be verbally elegant. They can be refined. They can even be admired. That's the uncomfortable inheritance of classical power. It didn't invent deception, but it professionalized it. It taught societies how to launder self-interest through language. And as we move forward, the stages get narrower. Power concentrates into courts and inner circles where surveillance is constant and access is everything. In the next chapter, we'll enter that pressure cooker where a single misstep can destroy you and where emotional detachment becomes a competitive advantage.
Chapter 4. Medieval Courts, the Pressure Cooker of Surveillance. Rain keeps time against leaded glass. Inside an ivy-dark hall, candles burn low, and every sound feels accounted for. A servant pauses too long at a doorway. A noblewoman adjusts her sleeve, hiding a bruise of ink from a hurried letter. Somewhere down the corridor, a laugh lands half a second late, as if the person laughing is checking whether it's allowed. In a medieval court, you don't just live among people. You live inside their attention. The stakes aren't abstract. A badly chosen alliance can cost land. A careless remark can cost protection. A rumor can cost your place at the table, which often means your ability to eat, to marry, to keep your children safe. And because courts run on favor, not fairness, you can't simply appeal to rules. The rules belong to whoever is closest to the center. That environment rewards a specific kind of psychological adaptation, the ability to remain emotionally detached while everyone else is emotionally exposed. Not because detachment is noble, because detachment is efficient. When surveillance becomes normal, honesty becomes expensive. People stop speaking plainly, not because they're deceitful by nature, but because they're surrounded by listeners who convert words into weapons. So the court teaches everyone the same lesson. Say less, imply more. Make your meaning portable. If challenged later, you can deny it. For a manipulator, this is fertile ground. If classical rhetoric was a public stage, the medieval court is a private laboratory. Power concentrates into tight spaces, royal chambers, councils, households, and access becomes the rarest resource. You don't dominate by winning debates in front of crowds. You dominate by controlling the corridor, the invitation, the schedule, the whispered update that arrives before the official news. This is where patronage becomes a kind of invisible chain. A patron offers protection, money, a title, a position near the center. But the gift is never just a gift. It's a tether. If you accept it, you accept dependency. And once dependency is established, reality becomes negotiable. You don't need to threaten someone openly when you can simply withdraw access. You can make their life smaller without ever raising your voice. For the person caught inside this system, the experience can be disorienting. One day you're valued. The next, you're difficult. Not because your work changed, but because you stopped agreeing with the story the patron needs told. The court also sharpens a technique we'll keep seeing, controlling reality by controlling information. In a world without mass communication, whoever controls the messenger controls the mind. Letters can be delayed. Messages can be misunderstood. A warning can be delivered with a subtle twist that turns it into an accusation. And because verification is slow, the lie has time to settle. It becomes the first version people heard, and the first version is the one that sticks. Meanwhile, something else is happening under the surface. People begin to treat trust as a liability. Even friendships become complicated because closeness creates leverage. If someone knows your fears, they can trade them. If someone knows your mistakes, they can keep them like coins. So intimacy becomes strategic. You don't reveal yourself for connection. You reveal yourself to negotiate safety. That's one of the darkest transformations in court life, the conversion of human closeness into currency. And for certain personalities, that conversion feels natural. If you already experience relationships as instrumental, a court doesn't corrupt you. It rewards you. It gives you structure. It gives you cover. You can behave coldly and call it prudence. You can betray someone and call it necessity. You can flatter a rival at breakfast and undermine them at dinner, and the room will treat it as skill. But there's a trade that comes with this. Surveillance doesn't only make people cautious. It makes them hungry. If you're watched constantly, you start craving private power, moments where you can finally influence without being observed. And that craving creates opportunities for the person who can offer secrecy, or offer belonging, or offer the feeling of being chosen. That's how manipulation often enters, not as force, but as relief. A patron leans in and speaks, as if you're the only sane person in the room. An advisor confides that the others don't appreciate you. A courtier offers a small, illicit favor and calls it loyalty. These gestures feel intimate, but they're often probes. The goal is to see what you'll do when you think the rules aren't watching. And when you comply, even once, the net tightens. Now there's a shared secret. Now there's a debt. Now there's a version of you that can be exposed. This is the pressure cooker, a place where everyone performs, where everyone listens, and where the most dangerous person is often the one who seems least reactive. Because calm reads as safety. Calm reads as maturity. Calm reads as control. And in a court, control is the closest thing to mercy you can buy. From here, the story naturally moves toward individuals who mastered this environment so well that their names still carry a particular chill. In the next chapter, we'll meet one of them, and we'll watch how fear becomes a tool engineered with timing.
Chapter 5. Cesare Borgia, The Anatomy of Strategic Fear. When people say Machiavellian, they often mean someone vaguely cold, vaguely strategic. But in the late 140s and early 150s Italy, strategy wasn't an aesthetic. It was a way to stay alive in a landscape of shifting alliances, mercenary armies, and city-states that could turn on you in a season. Cesare Borgia steps into this world already carrying leverage. He was the son of Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI. That single fact matters because it turns the church, an institution with spiritual authority and political reach, into a family engine. Cesare was made a cardinal while still young, a symbol of status bestowed from above, not earned from below. And then, in a move that signaled his real appetite, he gave up the cardinalate to pursue secular power. That pivot tells you something about the kind of mind we're studying. It isn't satisfied with symbolic authority. It wants control over bodies, territory, loyalty, and fear. And in Cesare's case, the center of gravity wasn't merely dominance. It was timing. His campaigns in the Romagna region weren't just a series of battles. They were a sequence of social operations. He used alliances when alliances were useful. He used force when force was efficient. And he used narrative to make it all seem inevitable, as if resistance was simply misunderstanding how the world worked. This is where we need to talk about strategic fear, because it's different from chaos. Unpredictable violence destabilizes. It creates desperate enemies, messy betrayals, and constant retaliation. But controlled cruelty, cruelty that follows a recognizable logic, can do something more chilling. It can make people adjust themselves. The people living under a ruler like this don't just fear punishment. They fear miscalculation. They begin scanning for what the ruler wants before the ruler has to say it. And when a population starts self-editing, a leader needs fewer soldiers. The mind becomes the prison. One of the most cited moments from Cesare's story involves Ramiro de Lorqua, often called Ramiro de Orco in older sources, a lieutenant placed in charge of pacifying the Romagna. The accounts describe Ramiro as imposing harsh order. Then, later, Cesare had him executed and his body displayed in a public space. The message wasn't subtle. The cruelty that frightened you yesterday can be punished today by the same hand that used it. It's hard to overstate how psychologically effective that is. It creates a double bind in the public mind. You fear the enforcer, but you also fear the ruler who can discard the enforcer without hesitation. And at the same time, you're offered a kind of relief. The ruler appears to be correcting excess, restoring balance, presenting himself as the final authority over violence itself. In modern terms, you could call this reputation engineering through scapegoating. But in human terms, it feels like standing near a fire while someone calmly demonstrates they control the oxygen. The deeper pattern is loyalty through anxiety. When the environment feels unstable, people cling to the figure who seems most capable of stabilizing it, even if that figure is the source of instability. This isn't stupidity. It's survival psychology. If you can't trust fairness, you start trusting power. If you can't trust law, you start trusting proximity to the person who bends it. What makes Cesare Borgia especially relevant is that his methods were observed, analyzed, and later distilled into political advice. Niccolò Machiavelli encountered Cesare as a diplomat for Florence. Machiavelli's writings, including The Prince, would later use Cesare as an example of certain kinds of political skill. We don't need to argue here about Machiavelli's personal admiration. What matters is that Cesare's behavior became data. A living case study for how fear, mercy, and appearance can be choreographed. And that choreography is where many people get trapped. Because a ruler like this doesn't rely on you believing he's good. He relies on you believing he's real. He relies on you believing resistance is naive. He relies on you believing you're safer adapting than challenging. Notice how this connects back to the court pressure cooker we just left. Surveillance teaches you to manage your words. Strategic fear teaches you to manage your thoughts. You begin rehearsing your loyalty internally. You anticipate accusation. You reduce your own complexity so you can't be misread. And over time, you forget what your personality looked like before self-protection became your main hobby. There's also a quieter cost. Fear narrows empathy. It makes communities suspicious. It makes neighbors less willing to defend each other. That fragmentation is useful to anyone consolidating power because unity creates accountability. Isolation creates dependency. So when we study Cesare Borgia here, we're not just collecting historical intrigue. We're watching one clean blueprint: create order with brutality, distance yourself from the brutality, and let the population recalibrate around the belief that only you can keep the violence reasonable. In the next chapter, we'll move from the man to the legacy. Not the legend, but the psychological split it normalizes, the idea that morality and effectiveness can be separated, and that people can be treated as levers without ever calling it cruelty.
Chapter 6. Machiavelli's Legacy, the Split Worldview. Machiavelli didn't invent coldness. He named a fracture that was already spreading through political life. A split between what people said they valued and what they rewarded. In that gap, a certain kind of personality thrives, because it doesn't experience the split as painful. It experiences it as clarity. To understand this, we need to step away from the drama of Cesare Borgia and look at what remains after the banners come down. What remains is a lesson that can be carried anywhere. If you treat morality as decoration, you can make decisions faster. You can pivot without guilt. You can betray without the slow internal cost that stops other people. And in systems where consequences are uneven, that speed can look like intelligence. This is the psychological split at the center of Machiavelli's legacy. Not good versus evil. Something more practical. Two worldviews living in the same room. One says relationships are bonds. The other says relationships are levers. If you live in the first worldview, you assume most people want mutual benefit. You read promises as meaningful. You feel an internal discomfort when you manipulate someone because your identity is tied to being trustworthy. You can still make hard decisions, but you pay for them inside yourself. If you live in the second worldview, you assume people are already playing games. Trust is not a virtue, it's a vulnerability. Loyalty is not a bond, it's an arrangement. And if you do feel discomfort, you treat it as noise to be managed, not guidance to be followed. The thing is, a Machiavellian style doesn't always look cruel on the surface. Often it looks reasonable. It sounds like being realistic. It uses calm language and modest claims. It even borrows moral phrases when they're useful. But underneath, the person is running a different operating system. Their focus isn't on what's right. It's on what works. That creates a dangerous confusion for everyone around them, because we instinctively assume shared meanings. When someone says, "I care about fairness," we assume they mean it as a value. But a strategic mind can use that sentence as camouflage. Fairness becomes a tool to recruit allies. Compassion becomes a public costume. Integrity becomes something you perform when eyes are on you, and suspend when they aren't. This is what I mean by people as levers. The person isn't necessarily thinking, "How do I hurt you?" They're thinking, "How do I move you?" They study what you want, what you fear, and what you can't tolerate socially. Then they apply pressure in the quiet places. Sometimes the pressure is praise. If admiration makes you pliable, they'll admire you. Sometimes the pressure is confusion. If you hate uncertainty, they'll give you mixed signals and let you chase clarity. Sometimes the pressure is belonging. If you need a group, they'll offer you membership and attach conditions later. A simple analogy helps here. Think of a door with a lock. Most people use a key because they accept the boundary. A strategic manipulator doesn't rage at the lock. They test the hinges. They watch who has a copy. They learn the building's schedule. They might even become friends with the person who installed it. The goal isn't to break the door. It's to make the door irrelevant. And this leads us to rational betrayal. In Machiavelli's shadow, betrayal can be framed as risk calibration. If loyalty is an arrangement, then ending loyalty isn't a moral collapse. It's an update. The person watches the room, senses the shift, and changes sides before anyone else admits the shift is happening. For people who aren't built that way, this feels unreal. You might think, "But we agreed," or "But we were close." And the response you get isn't usually open cruelty. It's often a look of mild impatience, as if your belief in shared meaning is childish. The betrayal lands twice, once in the action and again in the implied judgment that you should have seen it coming. This is why Machiavellianism so often pairs with a certain kind of cynicism. Cynicism isn't just negativity. It's a worldview that preemptively dissolves moral expectations, so the person never has to feel like the villain. If everyone's selfish, then exploiting people is simply participating in reality. If everyone lies, then lying well is competence. Cynicism becomes an anesthetic. But there's a hidden cost, even for the strategist. When you live inside constant calculation, you eventually lose access to simple trust. You can still form alliances, but intimacy becomes difficult because intimacy requires mutual vulnerability. And vulnerability is precisely what the strategic mind tries to avoid. So the person stays busy, stays in motion, stays effective, while quietly becoming emotionally isolated. For everyone else, the cost is different. When you're close to someone who splits morality from effectiveness, you start doubting your own perceptions. You start asking whether your values are naive. You start bargaining with yourself. Maybe this is just how adults act. That's the infection, not the specific tactic, but the slow normalization of treating people as objects. In the next chapter, the story shifts again. We move from political philosophy into early clinical language, where charm without conscience becomes a problem medicine tries to name.
Chapter 7. From Moral Insanity to Clinical Language. The moment these patterns enter medicine, something changes. The question stops being, "Is this person wicked?" and becomes, "What kind of mind does this?" And that sounds like progress. But it creates a new problem. Once you move from moral language to clinical language, you can start mistaking the label for the whole person. In the early 19th century, some physicians began describing a disturbing type they kept encountering. People who could speak clearly. People who seemed rational. People who could explain right and wrong in detail. And yet, their lives left a trail of harm that didn't match their apparent understanding. They weren't confused. They weren't hallucinating. They weren't intellectually impaired. The oddity was emotional. The absence of remorse. The lack of internal restraint. One influential term was moral insanity, later echoed by phrases like moral imbecility. The wording is dated and uncomfortable now, but the attempt behind it is worth noticing. Clinicians were trying to name a split they observed in real patients, intact reasoning on the surface, paired with disordered conscience and impulse underneath. If you've ever dealt closely with someone like this, you recognize the emotional whiplash. You keep expecting the normal sequence. Harm happens, guilt follows, repair begins. But the sequence doesn't arrive. Instead, you get explanation without accountability, charm without responsibility, sometimes even a performance of regret that evaporates the moment it stops being useful. This is where early psychiatry started circling a central question. Can a person understand moral rules and still feel no pull to follow them? That question pushed clinical thought toward what we'd later call personality disorders. Not disorders of logic, but disorders of relational structure. How someone bonds. How someone uses other people. What feelings show up and which ones seem missing. Around the mid-20th century, Hervey Cleckley's work, especially The Mask of Sanity, shaped a modern image of psychopathy that still echoes today. Cleckley described individuals who could appear normal, even impressive, articulate, poised, socially fluent, while living with a profound emotional shallowness and chronic irresponsibility. The mask wasn't a metaphor for a single lie. It was a stable presentation. A convincing surface that could make outsiders doubt the reports of the people closest to the harm. And that's an important pivot in our story. Up to this point, we've mostly been watching these traits through power, courts, politics, survival strategy. Clinical language forces us to look at them in ordinary rooms, hospitals, families, workplaces, marriages. It also introduces a quieter kind of danger, the successful case. Because not everyone who lacks empathy ends up in prison. Some learn social scripts early. Some are protected by status. Some are intelligent enough to avoid clear evidence. Some operate inside institutions where harm can be disguised as policy, standards, or just how things are done. If you only recognize predation when it's loud, you miss the kind that wears professionalism. This is why modern assessment tools became so significant, and also why they're often misunderstood. Tools like Hare's psychopathy checklist were designed for structured evaluation, typically in forensic contexts, not for casual labeling. They reflect patterns, chronic deceit, shallow affect, parasitic lifestyle, impulsive antisocial behavior, but they require training, evidence, and careful scoring. In other words, they're not supposed to be used as weapons in personal disputes. Here's the tension we have to hold. Naming patterns can protect you, but naming can also become a new kind of control. If you start throwing diagnoses at people, you mimic the very behavior you're trying to defend against, turning a human being into an object, a category, a story you can dominate. So the more useful stance is pattern recognition without moral theater. You watch behavior over time. You track consistency. You look for accountability, not charm. You notice whether apologies lead to repair, or whether apologies function like a reset button that lets the same harm continue. And you respect the limits of what we can know from the outside. A trait profile isn't a confession. A label isn't proof. But repeated behavior is data. And the body often registers that data before the mind accepts it, the tension in your chest, the vigilance after conversations, the sense that you're being managed rather than met. Clinical language didn't solve the problem of the Dark Triad. It gave us sharper lenses. But every lens can distort if you use it to replace judgment instead of support it. In the next chapter, we'll step into measurement, the attempt to quantify these traits with modern scales, and the trade between speed and precision.
Chapter 8. The Measurement of Shadow, SD3 and the Dirty Dozen. Once clinicians and researchers had language for these patterns, the next question was unavoidable. How do you measure something that hides? Because these traits don't present like a fever. They don't show up on an X-ray. They show up in choices, in tone, in what someone does when there's no immediate cost. And the moment you try to study that, you run into a problem that's almost philosophical. The people most invested in controlling perception are often skilled at controlling the perception of themselves. So measurement becomes a kind of compromise, not a perfect window into the soul, but a structured way to sample tendencies, to compare groups, to test hypotheses, to move beyond pure storytelling without pretending we can reduce a human being to a number. In modern personality research, two well-known self-report measures come up again and again when people study the Dark Triad, the short Dark Triad, often called the SD3, and a brief scale commonly known as the Dirty Dozen. The SD3 is a 27-item questionnaire designed to measure the three traits with more nuance than earlier ultra-short screens. It doesn't ask you, are you a narcissist? It uses statements that map onto typical motivations and behaviors, then looks at the pattern of endorsement. The key word is pattern. One item doesn't diagnose a trait. The distribution across items is the signal. This matters because the Dark Triad isn't one thing. Even when traits overlap, the internal reasons can differ. Two people might lie. One lies for admiration. One lies for advantage. One lies because they enjoy the game and don't feel pulled toward guilt. Similar behavior, different engine. The Dirty Dozen, by contrast, is a 12-item measure. It's quick. It's blunt. It's often used when researchers need speed, when a study already has many other measures, or when they're doing early screening and want a broad signal. But speed comes with trade-offs. With fewer items, you get less texture, less separation between facets, more risk that you're capturing general antagonism rather than the distinct contours of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. This is where we need to slow down, because these tools are easy to misuse in everyday conversation. A self-report scale isn't a verdict. It's an instrument, and every instrument has limits. First, self-report depends on self-awareness and honesty. If someone lacks insight, they may answer in ways that reflect how they prefer to see themselves. If someone is intentionally managing impressions, they may answer as a performance. And even when someone is sincere, a questionnaire captures a moment in time. Mood, context, recent conflicts, and social desirability can all shape responses. Second, these scales measure traits on a continuum, not categories like monster and normal. Most people have some degree of self-interest, some degree of image management, some capacity to rationalize harm. The question is intensity, rigidity, and cost to others over time. So why do these measures matter at all? Because they allow researchers to do something we can't do with intuition alone. Compare large groups systematically. Study correlations with other variables. Test whether certain patterns cluster together. Examine overlap and divergence. When studies use the SD3, they're often trying to hold the three traits apart long enough to see their different motivations. Narcissism tends to revolve around self-importance and the hunger for admiration. Machiavellianism tends to revolve around cynicism, strategy, and instrumental relationships. Psychopathy tends to revolve around callousness, low remorse, and often impulsive antisocial tendencies. That's a simplified framing, but it captures the point. The same outward behavior can be driven by different internal incentives. And this is where trait overlap becomes a central theme. Researchers consistently notice that these traits share a common dark core, often described as callousness or low empathy, while still diverging in style. You can think of it like three roads that pass through the same bleak neighborhood, then branch into different landscapes. The overlap explains why people confuse them. The divergence explains why the same defense strategy won't work equally well with each. If you're listening for personal protection, the most useful takeaway isn't the names of the scales. It's the fact that measurement forces us to stop relying on single behaviors. One dramatic event can be misleading. A charming apology can be misleading. A quiet period can be misleading. Patterns are harder to fake for long. Someone high in image-driven grandiosity may react sharply to status threat. Someone high in strategic manipulation may appear cooperative when penalties are high, then exploit when monitoring drops. Someone high in callousness may show an eerie consistency, harm, justification, and no lasting repair. But we have to stay honest about what the data can't do. A scale score can't tell you the whole story of a relationship. It can't replace evidence. It can't replace your lived sense of safety. And it certainly can't justify turning a person into a target for amateur diagnosis. So we hold these tools the way you'd hold a compass in fog. Useful for orientation. Dangerous if you mistake it for the terrain. Next, we'll move from measurement to the body itself. Not as destiny, but as circuitry. How reward processing can reinforce the pursuit of admiration and why attention can function like fuel.
Chapter 9. Narcissism's Reward Network, the Striatum, and the Chase. A heavy brass clock ticks in a silent study. The kind of room where nothing is rushed, yet everything feels measured. The sound isn't loud, but it claims the space anyway. Tick, tick, tick. It's the steady reminder that time passes whether you're admired or not. For someone organized around narcissistic needs, time can feel like a threat. Not because they fear aging in a simple way, but because admiration has to be renewed. Attention fades. Rooms move on. People get tired. And inside that quiet fact, you can start to see the shape of the chase. To understand it deeper, we have to move from behavior into the brain's reward circuitry. Neuroscience doesn't prove a personality style the way a fingerprint proves identity. But it can help explain why certain pursuits become sticky, repetitive, and hard to interrupt. In research discussions, narcissism is often linked to reward processing, especially the striatum, including the caudate. These regions are heavily involved in learning from rewards, anticipating payoff, and reinforcing behaviors that lead to something desirable. In plain terms, it's part of the system that teaches you, do that again. Now, that's true for everyone. You're not abnormal because your brain learns from rewards. The difference is what the reward is and how much your sense of self depends on it. Admiration can function like fuel because it does two jobs at once. It feels good and it stabilizes identity. The attention doesn't just bring pleasure. It brings coherence. It says, I'm real. I matter. I'm above doubt. And if your internal foundation is fragile, that external signal becomes more than a preference. It becomes a requirement. This is where supply seeking makes psychological sense. Not as a buzzword, but as a lived loop. The person moves towards situations that give them reflection, praise, envy, fascination, outrage, even fear. Any emotional intensity that keeps them central can serve the same function, proof of importance. And because the reward system learns quickly, it starts shaping choices. If a certain style of story gets you attention, you tell it again. If a certain kind of conflict puts you at the center, you provoke it. If being the victim brings instant validation, you become the victim on schedule. Over time, it can look like personality, but it's also reinforcement. A training program with the audience as the trainer. Here's the part that often confuses people close to it. The person may seem confident, even superior. But the emotional economy underneath is frequently debt-based. The room owes them recognition. The partner owes them reassurance. The friend owes them loyalty displayed publicly. If the debt isn't paid, it isn't experienced as disappointment. It's experienced as injury. Status threat is the trigger that exposes this most clearly. When admiration drops, when someone else gets credit, when the person is corrected, ignored, or replaced, the system doesn't just register less reward. It can register danger. That's why contempt shows up so reliably. Contempt isn't just rude. It's protective. If the other person can be framed as stupid, immoral, jealous, or beneath respect, then their opinion doesn't count. And if their opinion doesn't count, the narcissistic self-image can stay intact. Contempt is an emergency patch on a wounded identity. This is also why apologies can feel strange in these dynamics. Not impossible, but often strategic. An apology might appear when it restores access to admiration or when consequences threaten status. But accountability, real accountability, requires accepting a lowered position for a moment. It requires tolerating shame without discharging it onto someone else. For a person whose reward loop is tied to being above the room, that tolerance can feel unbearable. We should be careful with categories here because narcissism exists on a range. There's ordinary self-focus. There's ambition. There's pride. And then there's a rigid dependency on being special, where relationships become mirrors, not meetings. So the question isn't, does this person like praise? Most people do. The question is, what happens when praise isn't available? Do they remain stable, or do they start extracting it? Extraction can be subtle. They might fish for reassurance with self-pity. They might steer conversations back to themselves. They might inflate achievements or rewrite history. They might punish you with coldness until you restore the admiration they feel entitled to. Notice what's happening. The reward system doesn't just pull them toward pleasure. It pulls them toward control of the social environment because control increases the probability of reward. A simple analogy helps. Think of a slot machine that pays out just often enough to keep you playing. You don't leave because you should. You leave when your nervous system can tolerate not being fed. If attention is the payout, the narcissistic chase can start to resemble compulsion. Not always dramatic, sometimes polished, but repetitive and oddly joyless beneath the surface. And for you, the person nearby, the cost is psychological drift. You start adapting your behavior to prevent the status threat. You pre-edit your truth. You become careful with praise, careful with disagreement, careful with who gets noticed. Without realizing it, you begin orbiting their reward loop. What matters most isn't the terminology. It's the pattern: admiration as regulation, contempt as defense, and relationships treated as supply lines. Next, we'll shift to a different engine entirely. Not the chase for reflection, but the cooler machinery of planning, how strategic minds use executive control to override emotion for long-term advantage.
Chapter 10. Machiavellian Executive Control, the DLPFC Override. If narcissism chases a feeling, Machiavellianism chases an outcome. It's quieter, less hungry for applause, more interested in leverage, timing, and control that doesn't look like control. You usually don't notice it at first because it can resemble maturity, patience, composure, someone who doesn't overreact, someone who thinks 3 steps ahead. But if you stay close long enough, you start to sense the difference between emotional regulation and emotional absence. Not numbness, not dissociation, something more deliberate, a habit of overriding the human impulse to bond in favor of the strategic impulse to win. In modern neuroscience discussions, Machiavellian decision-making is often connected to executive control networks, especially regions in the prefrontal cortex. One area that comes up frequently is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. This region is involved in planning, working memory, and the ability to inhibit immediate impulses in favor of longer-term goals. For most people, that inhibition helps you behave well. You pause before you lash out. You think before you spend money. You consider consequences. But inhibition can also be repurposed. If your goal isn't harmony but advantage, executive control becomes a tool for suppressing inconvenient emotions. Guilt, compassion, the reflex to explain yourself honestly, the urge to repair after harm. You don't have to be incapable of these feelings to behave as if they don't matter. You only have to treat them as noise. This is one reason Machiavellianism can look stable from the outside. You might see someone who stays calm during conflict, who negotiates smoothly, who doesn't get visibly rattled, and you assume that calmness is character. But sometimes it's simply calculation with good posture. Researchers often study strategic social behavior using variations of trust games, situations where cooperation and betrayal have measurable payoffs. In these setups, what's striking is how often cooperation becomes camouflage. A strategic person doesn't always exploit immediately. They learn the penalty structure. They estimate monitoring. They ask one quiet question: what does this system punish, and what does it reward? If the system punishes open betrayal, they won't betray openly. They'll cooperate just enough to look safe. They'll build a small history of reasonableness. They'll let you tell yourself the story that you can trust them. And then, when the cost of exploitation drops, when oversight fades, when you're tired, when you need them, they'll take what they came for. This is where reaction time matters in a psychological sense, not because we're turning people into lab graphs, but because it reflects an internal process. A Machiavellian move often includes a pause, not a confused pause, a choosing pause. You can feel them scanning the room, and selecting the version of themselves that fits the moment. That's executive control in action. The person isn't pulled by the immediate emotional weather. They're steering through it. And if you're not used to being treated as a variable, it can be unsettling. You might walk away from conversations feeling oddly adjusted, as if you consented to something without remembering the moment you agreed. The manipulation here isn't always in the words. It's in the structure. The person limits your options without announcing that they're doing it. They frame choices so that each path benefits them. They offer help that creates debt. They withhold clarity until you're off balance, then present their solution as the only adult option. A simple analogy helps. Think of a chess player who isn't fixated on taking pieces. They're fixated on restricting your moves. You still have choices, technically, but each choice was built for you. You're playing inside their design. This also explains the Machiavellian relationship to cooperation. Cooperation isn't a moral stance. It's a tactic that changes depending on risk. When penalties are high, social, legal, professional, they can appear almost pro-social. Warm enough, fair enough, sometimes even generous, if generosity buys reputation. But remove the penalty, and the emotional tone can shift fast. Not into rage, necessarily. Into indifference. You see how quickly they can detach when empathy stops paying. In everyday life, you often encounter this as a certain kind of reasonable cruelty. A person uses policy language to justify harm. They cite precedent. They talk about standards. They speak as if their hands are tied, while quietly tightening the rope. They're not emotional, which makes it harder to confront them, because your distress becomes the loudest thing in the room. And that's part of the design. If you react strongly, they can label you unstable. If you stay calm, they can keep moving the terms. Either way, you're spending energy responding while they're spending energy steering. Over time, the imbalance grows. What's important to realize is that strategic control doesn't require brilliance. It requires consistency. It requires a willingness to prioritize outcome over mutual reality again and again until you start doubting whether mutual reality exists at all. So when we talk about the DLPFC override, we're not diagnosing strangers. We're describing a style of internal governance. Cognition driving the car, emotion strapped in the trunk. Planning as a substitute for conscience. Self-control used not to protect others from you, but to protect your image while you extract what you want. And now, with that in mind, we're ready to move to the next corner of the triad. Not the planner, not the performer, the person whose calm isn't strategic, but vacant. The mask that doesn't slip because it was never attached to a stable self in the first place.
Chapter 11. The Shift to the Tetrad, Psychopathy and Everyday Sadism. Psychopathy is the corner of the Dark Triad that people think they understand until they meet a version that doesn't look like a headline. Not the caricature. Not the cinematic predator. Just someone who moves through ordinary spaces with an odd kind of emotional silence, as if the usual internal alarms never quite ring. In research, psychopathy is often described through facets rather than a single trait, because the pattern isn't one feature. It's a configuration. One facet is interpersonal, superficial charm, deceit, a talent for social mimicry. Another is affective, shallow emotion, low remorse, callousness. Another is lifestyle, impulsivity, stimulation-seeking, a preference for immediate payoff. And then there's the antisocial facet, rule-breaking, aggression, and the willingness to cross lines that most people won't cross even when they're angry. What's important is that these facets can combine in different proportions. Some people score high on the interpersonal and affective style and still avoid obvious legal trouble. Others are more visibly chaotic, with lifestyle impulsivity and antisocial behavior that leaves a trail. That difference matters because it shapes how harm appears. Sometimes it arrives as a dramatic rupture. Sometimes it arrives as a calm erosion. And there's a deeper layer here, one that complicates the old idea that psychopathy is simply born. Longitudinal and meta-analytic research has found moderate associations between childhood maltreatment and overall psychopathy, with stronger links to behavioral and antisocial facets, and weaker but still present links to affective and interpersonal facets. That doesn't mean trauma creates psychopathy in a simple one-to-one way. It does mean we have to be careful with narratives that treat callousness as pure mystery. Sometimes what looks like absence is actually adaptation hardened into personality. One longitudinal example comes from the Pittsburgh Youth Study, where psychopathy-related traits measured around early adolescence showed moderate stability into young adulthood, with correlations around R equals 0.31 over a decade. That's not destiny. It's continuity. It tells you the pattern can persist, but it also tells you that predicting an individual outcome from a score is limited. In other words, stability exists, but certainty doesn't. So if we're speaking in a protective, practical way, the question becomes less, what caused this person, and more, what does the pattern do to the people near it? Psychopathy's signature in relationships is often the absence of reciprocal weight. Most people feel the gravity of consequences. Even when they act selfishly, they carry aftertaste, anxiety, guilt, rumination, the urge to repair. With psychopathy, that aftertaste can be reduced or missing. Harm can happen, and the person can remain internally unbothered. The calmness isn't discipline like the Machiavellian planner. It's detachment. This is also why charm is so effective here. Charm is often misunderstood as friendliness. But in this context, it's access. It's a fast pass through other people's defenses. The person watches which version of themselves makes you relax, and then they wear it. Not forever, just long enough. Now, Chapter 11 is also where the story expands from the Triad to the Tetrad, because researchers began paying attention to something adjacent. Not just low empathy and manipulation, but the capacity to enjoy cruelty. Everyday sadism doesn't require torture chambers. It can show up in small, socially permitted forms, humiliating someone because you can, provoking distress for entertainment, enjoying power when another person is visibly uncomfortable. Sometimes it's direct. Sometimes it's disguised as just joking, with the joke structured so the target can't protest without looking sensitive. And that matters because sadism isn't merely instrumental. Machiavellianism uses harm as a tool. Narcissism uses harm as a defense. Psychopathy can use harm as indifference. Sadism introduces another motive, harm as pleasure. When researchers describe sadism in everyday contexts, they're often looking at the enjoyment of inflicting distress even when there's no practical reward. No money, no status gain, no strategic outcome, just the internal payoff of watching someone squirm. That's a different engine, and it changes the risk landscape. Because you can negotiate with someone who wants something. You can't negotiate with someone who wants you to suffer. This is where unprovoked aggression becomes a signal worth taking seriously. Not reactive anger after a conflict. Not a boundary set clumsily. But a pattern of initiating discomfort, then acting puzzled when it's noticed. The person might deny intent, then repeat it. Or they might admit it softly, as if you're supposed to respect their honesty about enjoying domination. A quiet way to think about the tetrad is to imagine 4 pressures that can drive someone's behavior. Narcissism pressures you to preserve a grand self-image. Machiavellianism pressures you to preserve advantage. Psychopathy pressures you to preserve freedom from emotional consequence. Sadism pressures you to preserve the feeling of power that comes from someone else's distress. These pressures can overlap, but the felt experience around them is different. If you've lived near one, you often remember the atmosphere more than the events. With narcissism, you remember walking on eggshells around status. With Machiavellianism, you remember feeling managed. With psychopathy, you remember confusion at how little your pain registered. With sadism, you remember the cold realization that your pain did register, and that was the point. We should also say this carefully. Not everyone with psychopathic traits is violent. Not everyone who enjoys dark humor is a sadist. Trait language describes tendencies, not guarantees. But patterns, over time, are difficult to ignore. And what makes the tetrad useful is that it stops us from compressing every kind of harm into one explanation. Because if you misread the motive, you respond wrong. You offer empathy to someone who experiences it as weakness. You offer negotiation to someone who experiences it as a game. You offer closeness to someone who experiences it as access. So this chapter isn't here to make you paranoid. It's here to give you a sharper map. A map that includes not just manipulation for gain, but cruelty for enjoyment. And once you can name that possibility, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, how do I make them understand what they did? And you start asking, what does this person consistently seek when no one is watching?
Chapter 12. The 5 Families of Manipulation. So now we bring the map down to street level. Up to this point, we've moved through evolution, courts, early clinical language, measurement, and circuitry. We've talked about motives and networks. But if you're listening for protection, you don't need a perfect theory. You need pattern recognition that works when you're tired, when you're emotionally attached, and when the person across from you is smiling. This chapter is a field guide. 5 families of manipulation that show up across settings, across personality styles, across centuries. Not because every manipulator uses all 5, but because these 5 are reliable ways to control perception, attachment, and social proof. And once you can name the family, you stop arguing with the specific sentence. You stop chasing the moving target. You start responding to the structure. The first family is gaslighting. Gaslighting isn't just lying. Lying says, this didn't happen. Gaslighting says, your mind can't be trusted. It works by sanding down your confidence in your own memory, your own interpretation, your own emotional signals. It often begins softly, a casual correction, a laugh that frames your recollection as dramatic. Small phrases that don't feel dangerous until you notice the result. You start checking yourself before you speak. You start asking for permission to be certain. A key move here is context removal. A comment is pulled out of its situation and made to sound irrational. Another move is false consensus. Everyone thinks this. The point isn't accuracy. The point is isolation. If you feel alone in your perception, you become easier to steer. The second family is love bombing. This one confuses people because it feels like a gift. Attention, interest, warmth, intensity, rapid closeness. It can look like romance, mentorship, friendship, even spirituality. But the signature isn't the affection. It's the pace and the pressure. Love bombing is a shortcut around discernment. It tries to create commitment before you have enough data. And once you're bonded, the dynamic can flip. Praise becomes intermittent. Availability becomes conditional. You're kept in a state of reaching, trying to get back to the version of them that felt so certain at the beginning. The psychological mechanism is simple. Attachment is being used as leverage. When closeness is offered like oxygen, you'll do a lot to keep breathing. The third family is triangulation. Triangulation is when a third person or a third audience is inserted to control you. Sometimes it's obvious, an ex, a rival, a coworker whose opinion is treated like law. Sometimes it's invisible. People are saying, or you know what they think of you. The third party might not even exist as described. What matters is the feeling that you're being compared, evaluated, threatened with replacement, or pressured to compete. This tactic reshapes your focus. You stop asking what's true. You start asking what will keep you in good standing. And the longer you live inside triangulation, the more your identity becomes reactive. You become a performer in someone else's theater, auditioning for stability. The fourth family is emotional blackmail. This is the use of fear, obligation, and guilt as a control script. Not an occasional emotional moment. A pattern strategy. If you don't comply, you're told you're cruel, ungrateful, disloyal, or unsafe. The manipulator might threaten withdrawal of love, withdrawal of access, withdrawal of peace. Or they might imply self-harm, collapse, retaliation, or public humiliation. The form changes, but the structure stays the same. Your boundaries are reframed as violence. A subtle version is conditional care. Help is offered, but it arrives with a bill. And the bill is usually paid in silence, in compliance, or in abandoning your own needs. This family is powerful because it recruits your conscience against you. You aren't just being pushed. You're being made to feel wrong for resisting. The fifth family is the silent treatment. Silence is often framed as needing space, and sometimes it is. The difference is intent and pattern. The silent treatment is silence used as punishment and training. Communication is withdrawn to create anxiety, to create pursuit, to force apology, to force you to abandon the original issue. It's a form of social exclusion, and the human nervous system treats exclusion as danger. What makes it effective is that it contains no argument. There's nothing to refute. There's only absence. And in absence, many people will start bargaining with themselves. They'll lower their standards just to restore contact. Now, these 5 families don't operate separately in real life. They braid together. Gaslighting destabilizes your perception, therefore you rely more on the other person's interpretation. Love bombing creates rapid attachment. Therefore, leaving feels like losing a part of yourself. Triangulation creates social pressure. Therefore, you fear replacement. Emotional blackmail recruits guilt. Therefore, you confuse compliance with goodness. Silent treatment trains you through deprivation. Therefore, you start preemptively obeying. You can think of it like a control room with 5 switches. The manipulator doesn't need all 5 switched on. They just need enough to keep you off balance. And this is the core aim: control of perception, attachment, and social proof. Perception is your reality. Attachment is your bond. Social proof is your standing with others. If someone can control those 3, they don't need physical force. They can make you police yourself. So the countermove begins with a quiet internal decision. You stop treating the conversation as the arena. You start treating the pattern as the data. You don't need to diagnose the person. You don't need to win the moral argument. You only need to notice what reliably happens when you say no, when you ask for clarity, when you stop performing. Because the moment you can predict the response, the spell weakens. And from here, we're ready to move into the ledger. Not theory, not history. Specific techniques, small enough to miss in the moment, but consistent enough to change your life if you don't name them. Techniques 1 to 15, the perimeter and the bond. The techniques begin where most people least expect danger. Not in cruelty, not in shouting, not in obvious threats. They begin at the perimeter. Because before someone can control your choices, they usually try to measure your boundaries. Before someone can rewrite your reality, they need to learn how certain you are of your own memory. Before someone can use attachment as leverage, they need to see how quickly you bond and what makes you stay. So we start with the early moves, the ones that feel small enough to excuse. And we treat them as patterns, not as moral judgments. Technique 1 is the boundary micro-push. This is the smallest possible violation, delivered with a tone that asks you to ignore it. A joke at your expense that lands a little too precisely. A harmless request that costs you more than it should. A comment that crosses intimacy too fast. A moment where your no is met with a grin instead of respect. The stakes here aren't the request itself. The stakes are the data it produces. If you let it pass, the person learns that your boundary isn't a line. It's a suggestion. If you protest, they learn where the edge is and what kind of protest you offer. Do you laugh to soften it? Do you explain? Do you apologize for having a boundary at all? Do you go quiet? A micro-push is like tapping a fence post to see if it's anchored. And notice the emotional trap. If it's small, you feel silly making it a thing. If you make it a thing, you fear looking rigid. So you tolerate it. And your tolerance becomes the invitation to the next push. Technique 2 is the compliance wedge, often described as foot in the door. The person doesn't start with the big ask. They start with the easy yes. A tiny favor, a quick errand, a small secret, a minor exception, something that costs you just enough to create a feeling of involvement. Not love, not loyalty, involvement. Because once you're involved, you tend to see yourself as the kind of person who helps them. And the next request can be larger because it isn't evaluated on its own. It's evaluated as part of a growing identity. This is why you'll sometimes notice the ask comes with a compliment. You're the only one I can trust with this. Or, you're the kind of person who gets it. The compliment isn't kindness. It's a frame. It tries to shape your self-concept into a role that serves them. If you accept the role, declining later feels like betraying who you are. Technique 3 is the time pressure ask. The request arrives with urgency that isn't yours. I need an answer right now. This can't wait. If you don't decide today, it's over. Sometimes the urgency is real. Often it's manufactured. The purpose is simple: shrink your thinking. When you're rushed, you consult your anxiety instead of your judgment. You prioritize ending discomfort. You make a decision to stop the pressure, not because the decision is right. Time pressure also blocks one of the most important protective behaviors: checking reality with someone else. Getting a second opinion. Looking at the pattern over time. Asking, is this consistent with what I know? A manipulator understands that speed is their ally. If you slow down, you might notice the terms are unfair. Now, those are the perimeter tests. Small violations, small commitments, rushed decisions. They're not the whole trap. They're the first measurements. From here, we move into gaslighting foundations. These aren't always dramatic. In fact, the most effective gaslighting often sounds like concern. Technique 4 is memory abrasion. This is the gradual wearing down of your confidence in recall, not one blatant denial. A series of small corrections that treat your perception as unreliable. You're remembering it wrong. That's not what I said. You always twist things. Are you sure you didn't just assume that? In a healthy relationship, people misremember. They clarify. They check. They apologize when they're wrong. The difference is the direction of force. Memory abrasion consistently pushes the mistake onto you. It never lands on them. It leaves you doing the work of doubt while they keep the comfort of certainty. Over time, you start archiving your own mind like it's a suspect. Technique 5 is context removal. You said something in a specific situation with a specific tone after a specific event. They retell it without any of that. Your words are stripped of the conditions that made them reasonable. If you raise a concern, it's labeled attacking. If you set a boundary, it's framed as controlling. If you ask for clarity, it becomes interrogating. The context that would protect you is removed. Therefore, the meaning is altered. And once the meaning is altered, your character can be judged. This tactic is especially effective socially because it produces short, shareable narratives. A complex reality is hard to repeat. A simple accusation travels. Technique 6 is false consensus. Everyone thinks this. People have noticed. I'm not the only one who feels that way. Sometimes it's true that others have concerns. Often it's vague on purpose. The goal isn't accuracy. The goal is social pressure without accountability. If you ask, who said that? You're told you're missing the point or being paranoid. If you accept it, you feel outnumbered. And when you feel outnumbered, you become eager to regain standing, even if it costs you truth. False consensus turns your private reality into a public trial without evidence. Technique 7 is reality laundering. This is when the person takes an argument that would sound cruel if stated directly and cleans it with softer language. They don't say, I'm trying to control you. They say, I'm just trying to help. They don't say, I don't want you to have support. They say, those people aren't good for you. They don't say, I need you confused. They say, you're overthinking. The laundering is in the tone. The words are shaped to sound caring. Therefore, resisting them feels like resisting care. And that is the hook. You begin to doubt whether your resistance is selfish. Technique 8 is the concerned witness posture. They speak as if they're observing you neutrally, diagnosing you gently for your own good. I'm worried about you. I think you're not yourself lately. I don't think you're seeing things clearly. Again, sometimes concern is real. But this posture becomes manipulation when it replaces accountability. When your objections are treated not as data, but as symptoms. If you say, you hurt me, and the response is, I'm worried about your emotional stability, you've just been moved from partner to patient. And once you're the patient, your reality is discounted. Technique 9 is incremental contradiction. A bigger lie is easier to spot. Smaller contradictions, spread over time, make you tired. One day they say they love your independence. Next week they call it selfish. One day they say they want honesty. Next week they punish you for being honest. They don't explain the change. They don't acknowledge it. They simply shift the rules, then behave as if the new rules were always obvious. This produces a particular mental state, rule fog. You start scanning for what's allowed today. You hesitate. You self-edit. You become compliant not because you agree, but because you want to avoid the punishment that comes from violating rules you can't see. And now we pivot into the third cluster, love bombing and withdrawal. We're not talking about romance only. This can happen in friendships, workplaces, spiritual communities, mentorships. Anywhere someone can offer intensity and then ration it. Technique 10 is the intensity shortcut. They skip the normal pace of knowing you. They move fast into closeness. Too much self-disclosure too soon. Too much praise too soon. Constant contact. Grand statements about connection. The sense that you've been recognized. The psychological effect is that you confuse acceleration with depth. Depth takes time. It includes conflict, repair, boredom, routine, and the slow testing of trust. Intensity can imitate depth, but it doesn't have to earn it. And when you bond to intensity, you start seeking the feeling rather than evaluating the person. Technique 11 is future painting. They build a vivid story of what the relationship, partnership, or alliance will become. It isn't simply optimism. It's a commitment device. They talk about plans, roles, belonging, legacy. They speak as if the future is already agreed upon. Therefore, questioning them feels like threatening the dream. Future painting can also be used to rush compliance. If we're going to build this together, I need you to trust me. The future becomes a hostage. If you hesitate, you're accused of not believing in it. It's important to realize that the future described here isn't evidence. It's persuasion. Technique 12 is selective mirroring. At first, they seem almost uncannily similar to you. They share your values, your tastes, your grievances, your humor, your language. They validate the wounds you rarely speak about. They feel safe because they feel familiar. Sometimes this similarity is organic. But when it's a tactic, it functions like a key cut to fit your lock. They listen for what you long for, then reflect it back, not as a lie, necessarily, but as a crafted self. This is why you can feel as if you've met someone who finally understands you, and later realize you barely know who they actually are. Technique 13 is intermittent warmth. Warmth becomes unpredictable. Care becomes sporadic. Affection shows up, then disappears. Not in response to anything you did clearly, but enough to keep you searching. This creates a powerful reinforcement schedule. When rewards are consistent, you relax. When rewards are intermittent, you chase. You start thinking, if I can just get it right, the good version returns. And that chase can become the relationship's core activity. Technique 14 is scarcity praise. Praise is offered like a limited resource. They don't compliment you freely. They ration approval, and when it arrives, it feels significant. Sometimes it's paired with a subtle comparison. Most people aren't like you. Or a subtle warning. Don't make me regret trusting you. Or a subtle condition. I'm proud of you when you're like this. The effect is that you begin shaping yourself to earn the rare praise. You adapt into the version that gets fed. Scarcity praise can also be used in professional settings, where recognition is tied to advancement. A leader gives small, private approval while withholding public credit. You stay hungry. You stay loyal. You keep producing. Technique 15 is the first withdrawal. This is the moment the bond is used. After intensity, after closeness, after you've adjusted your life around them, they create distance. They become harder to reach. They act distracted. They become vague. They offer less. And the withdrawal doesn't come with a direct explanation that can be discussed. It comes with ambiguity. Ambiguity is important because it keeps you working. If they clearly ended the relationship, you could grieve and leave. If they clearly stated a problem, you could address it or refuse it. But if they offered just enough connection to keep hope alive, you stay in the loop. The first withdrawal is also a test. It shows them how attached you are, how quickly you pursue, how willing you are to apologize for things you didn't do, just to restore contact. And if you comply, they learn something crucial. They can regulate you with access. Now, to hold all of this together, we need to name what's happening underneath these 15 techniques. It's not just manipulation as deception. It's conditioning. The perimeter tests condition you to accept small violations. The gaslighting foundations condition you to doubt your own mind. The bonding tactics condition you to associate closeness with intensity and stability with obedience. And once conditioning is in place, the later techniques, triangles, blackmail, reality editing, don't have to work as hard. You're already pre-shaped. So what do you do with this, without turning your life into constant suspicion? You slow the moment down. You treat urgency as a reason to pause, not a reason to rush. You watch how someone handles your first no, not your 10th, your first. You notice whether clarification leads to clarity or whether clarification leads to punishment. You pay attention to whether praise is offered as appreciation or used as a leash. And you remember a simple rule that's easy to forget when you're bonded. Closeness isn't proven by intensity. It's proven by consistency under stress. From here, the story moves into deeper structure. Once boundaries are tested and the bond is established, the tactics widen. They involve third parties, reputations, fear, obligation, guilt, and silence. Not because the manipulator suddenly becomes more evil, but because they've gathered enough data to choose the tools that fit you. And that's where we go next.
Chapter 13: Jim Jones, Narcissistic Leadership and Devotion. An old radio hums in a dim room, the kind of steady, distant sound that makes silence feel occupied. You can hear voices when you lean in close, but the words blur at the edges, like they aren't meant to be checked. That hum is useful. It keeps people from hearing their own doubts too clearly. Jim Jones didn't build devotion by arguing people into it. He built it by making belonging feel like survival. And that's why his story belongs here, after the techniques. Because once you understand perimeter tests, bonding, and reality shaping, you can recognize what happens when those methods scale up into a whole community. Jones rose as a charismatic religious and political figure, most famously associated with the People's Temple and the deaths in Jonestown in 1978. Those are public facts. But the psychological machinery that got people there wasn't a single moment of madness. It was structure, repeated over time, until the group's nervous system replaced the individual's. In narcissistic leadership, the leader's hunger isn't simply for praise. It's for centrality. The leader becomes the emotional sun. Everyone else becomes an orbit. Your feelings are meaningful if they reflect the leader. Your suffering is meaningful if it proves loyalty. Your identity is meaningful if it can be folded into the leader's narrative. Jones offered a version of moral grandeur. A story where the group was righteous, chosen, misunderstood. That kind of story is magnetic because it solves ordinary loneliness. It tells you your life isn't random. It tells you your pain has a purpose. And it quietly implies something else. If you leave, you aren't just leaving a community. You're leaving meaning itself. This is where ideological triangulation begins. Instead of one-on-one triangulation, using a rival or an ex, Jones helped create a worldview triangle: believers, traitors, and an enemy outside the walls. The outside world becomes corrupt, hostile, dangerous. The group becomes pure and persecuted. And the leader becomes the interpreter of threats. If you're frightened, you come to the leader for clarity. If you're confused, you come to the leader for reality. The technique isn't subtle, and it doesn't need to be. Once fear is installed, people stop demanding evidence. They demand direction. Meanwhile, the leader's image needs constant protection. Narcissistic leadership can't tolerate ordinary equality because equality implies the leader is just another person. And just another person is the one identity the narcissistic system can't metabolize. So the leader has to keep demonstrating specialness through knowledge, through sacrifice, through suffering, through claims of persecution, through claims of exceptional insight. What makes this dangerous is that the leader's vulnerability can become a weapon. If the leader says, "I'm exhausted," you work harder. If the leader says, "I'm betrayed," you prove loyalty. If the leader says, "I'm under attack," you accept restrictions. Emotional blackmail doesn't always sound like threats. Sometimes it sounds like tears that you aren't allowed to question. And in groups, the silent treatment becomes communal. You aren't just ignored by one person. You're iced out by the whole social world that has become your primary source of belonging. That kind of exclusion doesn't feel like discomfort. It can feel like death. Humans evolved to treat social expulsion as existential danger. A skilled leader uses that reflex without ever naming it. People often ask, why didn't they leave, as if leaving is a single decision. But if your job, friends, housing, identity, and moral meaning are all braided into the group, leaving isn't a step. It's a collapse. And the leader understands this. So dependence isn't accidental. It's engineered. Support systems outside the group weaken. Confidence becomes suspect. Doubt becomes evidence of contamination. This is where gaslighting becomes spiritualized. Your unease isn't treated as information. It's treated as a flaw in you. If you feel fear, it means you're not faithful enough. If you feel anger, it means you're selfish. If you feel confusion, it means you're listening to the wrong voices. The leader doesn't have to deny reality directly when the group can be trained to deny their own perception for him. And when cracks appear, the leader doesn't only reassure. He escalates. Intensity becomes proof. We've already talked about how intensity can imitate depth in love bombing. In a cultic context, intensity imitates truth. The more extreme the demand, the more real the mission feels. Sacrifice becomes evidence. Exhaustion becomes virtue. The cost itself becomes the argument. That's the trap. The more you give, the harder it is to admit you were used. So the narcissistic leader keeps people giving. He keeps them busy. He keeps them morally activated. And he makes sure their identity is fused to the cause, because once your identity is fused, criticism doesn't feel like feedback. It feels like annihilation. This isn't unique to one historical figure. But Jones shows the pattern in high resolution. Admiration turned into devotion, devotion turned into control, control turned into a closed world where the leader's needs and the group's reality were no longer separable. And the most chilling part is that, from inside, it can feel like love. Not because it is love, but because the nervous system reads relief as love when fear has been made constant. Next, we'll move to a different mask entirely, one that doesn't need devotion, only access.
Chapter 14. Ted Bundy, the Interpersonal Mask. Ted Bundy is often described in terms that belong to theater: charming, handsome, persuasive. But those words can distract you, because they make the danger sound like a rare charisma. The more accurate frame is simpler. He understood the interpersonal mask as a tool for access. Bundy's murders, and the extensive documentation surrounding his case, make him one of the most studied American serial killers. That visibility creates its own distortion. People think the lesson is about evil hiding behind a smile. The deeper lesson is about how quickly we outsource judgment to appearances that feel familiar. The interpersonal mask isn't a single performance. It's a collection of micro-performances: tone, timing, helplessness, politeness, the right amount of vulnerability. It's the ability to present as safe long enough for the other person's nervous system to stand down. In Bundy's case, there's a widely discussed detail that matters because it's so ordinary. He sometimes used props to appear less threatening. Accounts describe him using a sling or pretending to be injured to solicit help. The point wasn't the injury. The point was the social scripted triggers. When you see someone who looks slightly impaired, your mind moves toward assistance. Your guard drops because the situation feels morally clear. You're not choosing between safe and unsafe. You're choosing between helpful and cold. This is what I mean by social ease as access, not connection. Connection involves mutuality. It involves risk on both sides. But access is one way. The mask exists to move through your boundaries without activating them. And if you've never been targeted by someone like this, it can be hard to accept how fast it can happen. Not because people are foolish, but because most of us were trained to treat politeness as evidence. We assume that calmness means self-control. We assume that eye contact means honesty. We assume that a normal voice means a normal internal world. Bundy didn't need to convince everyone. He only needed to convince the right person in the right moment, when their attention was elsewhere and their social conditioning was working against them. That leads us to vulnerability sensing. This isn't a mystical ability. It's a practical one. A predatory person scans for small signals, who hesitates, who apologizes too quickly, who doesn't want to make a scene, who offers assistance before it's asked for, who looks away when uncomfortable. Those signals don't mean weakness in character. They often mean conscientiousness, empathy, social training. But in the wrong hands, those strengths become handles. And the scanning doesn't have to be conscious to be effective. Over time, a person who uses others learns which types are easier to maneuver. They learn which environments provide cover. They learn which situations make you comply automatically. Darkness isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just repetition without remorse. Bundy's case also exposes what we can call the public disbelief problem. When someone looks normal, when they speak smoothly, when they can play the role of a competent adult, people resist the idea that they could be dangerous. Witnesses can be doubted. Survivors can be interrogated. The story becomes, that doesn't fit what I saw. As if perception is a full investigation. This is where the interpersonal mask becomes more than a tactic. It becomes a shield. Because if an offender can present as credible, the burden shifts. The person reporting harm has to sound perfect. Their memory has to be flawless. Their emotions have to be calibrated. Their story has to be told in the right order with the right tone. Any deviation becomes a reason to dismiss them. And notice how closely that resembles gaslighting, even without direct contact. Social structures can gaslight. Institutions can gaslight. Communities can gaslight. The victim isn't only fighting the offender. They're fighting the fact that the offender's appearance gives them a default presumption of innocence, while the victim's distress makes them seem unstable. Bundy also forces us to confront an uncomfortable idea. Charm is not evidence of empathy. Charm can be mimicry. It can be language without depth. It can be a person using the map of human emotion without living inside it. We should be cautious here because we're not trying to turn this into a superstition about nice people. The goal isn't to distrust warmth. The goal is to stop treating warmth as proof of character. A simple analogy helps. Think of a counterfeit bill. It can look right, feel right, even pass through a few hands without question. The problem is that it was designed to pass. The design is the deception. The more it resembles the real thing, the more dangerous it becomes. So what protects you, practically, without turning you rigid? You watch for asymmetry. Who is benefiting from the interaction? Who is rushing it? Who is creating a scenario where saying no would feel socially costly? Who is asking for help in a way that isolates you from other people? Who seems to steer your attention away from your own internal signals? And you take seriously a subtle feeling many people ignore, the sense that you're being handled. Not persuaded, not invited, handled. Bundy's story is extreme in outcome, but the psychological mechanism is not exotic. It's the use of social scripts as shortcuts around consent. It's the exploitation of our desire to be decent. It's the way seeming safe can become a weapon. Next, we move back down from the headline case to the everyday ledger again, because the interpersonal mask is only one entry. The deeper pattern is the same. Techniques that create compliance before you notice you've agreed.
Techniques 16 to 33, triangles and blackmail. Technique 16 is rival insertion. A rival doesn't have to be a real competitor. It only has to feel real to you. The manipulator introduces a third person as a measuring stick, then quietly moves you back and forth against it. Sometimes it's an ex who understood them better. Sometimes it's a coworker who's more reliable. Sometimes it's a friend they suddenly praise with unusual warmth. The point is never the rival's actual qualities. The point is the pressure it creates in you. The stakes are simple. If you start competing for basic respect, you stop negotiating from equality. You negotiate from fear of replacement. And once that fear is installed, the manipulator doesn't need to demand effort. You volunteer it. Technique 17 is the messenger game. Instead of speaking directly, the manipulator routes communication through someone else. A friend, a colleague, a family member, a group chat. They frame it as efficiency or keeping the peace, but the real effect is fog. Messages arrive distorted. Tone gets lost. Context disappears. And because the message didn't come straight from the source, accountability dissolves. If you confront them, they can say, "That's not what I meant," or "You misunderstood." If you confront the messenger, you look petty. If you try to clarify, you have to chase the truth through multiple mouths. Meanwhile, the manipulator sits in the center, watching the confusion they created. Technique 18 is comparison worship. This is when the manipulator praises someone else in a way that isn't normal appreciation. It's worship, delivered in your presence, with a slight edge. The praise is exaggerated. It's repeated. It's strangely specific. And it always lands on the same quiet implication: you are falling short. The psychological impact isn't jealousy. It's self-surveillance. You start editing yourself to resemble the praised person. You start asking what standard you're being judged against. You start performing a version of yourself that's less true but more acceptable. And the manipulator gets what they wanted without ever asking: a partner or colleague who is busy trying to earn legitimacy. Technique 19 is the borrowed halo. The manipulator attaches themselves to an admired person, institution, or moral cause, then uses that attachment as credibility. It's social proof by association. They don't have to be trustworthy. They only have to look connected to trust. In everyday life, this sounds like name-dropping with a moral tone. I work with people who are serious. I've been trained by experts. My community holds high standards. The words are meant to shorten the time it takes you to relax. And once you relax, you stop verifying. You stop noticing inconsistencies. You start assuming that if others approve of them, you should too. Technique 20 is the split-stage performance. In private, the manipulator is dismissive, cold, controlling, or chaotic. In public, they become a different person. Helpful, calm, generous, reasonable. This isn't just hypocrisy. It's strategy. It creates a perception gap between your lived experience and the group's narrative. If you ever speak up, you sound unbelievable because people compare your report to the version of them they've seen. The stakes are isolation. You lose allies before you even ask for help. And inside that isolation, you start negotiating with yourself. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you misread it. Maybe you're the problem. Technique 21 is the rescue rivalry. This is a triangulation tactic disguised as care. The manipulator creates a crisis, sometimes real, sometimes inflated, and then positions themselves as the only one who can handle it. If you accept their help, you become indebted. If you question their help, you become ungrateful. If someone else offers support, the manipulator subtly undermines them, framing the other helper as incompetent, unsafe, or self-serving. Over time, your support network shrinks. Not because you chose isolation, but because every outside connection becomes a threat to the manipulator's position. They don't need to forbid you from having friends. They only need to make every friend feel like a liability. Technique 22 is the fog script. Fear, obligation, and guilt. This is the backbone of emotional blackmail. It's a predictable sequence that pressures you to comply while making you feel like compliance is your moral duty. Fear can be obvious: threats, intimidation, consequences. But fear is often subtler. Fear of conflict. Fear of losing love. Fear of being seen as cruel. Fear of the manipulator's collapse. Obligation is the story that turns pressure into responsibility. After all I've done for you, you owe me. This is what partners do. Obligation doesn't ask what is fair. It insists what is required. Guilt is the final seal. If you resist, you're made to feel like a bad person. Not someone making a different choice. A bad person. When you hear the fog script enough times, your boundaries start to feel like harm. Technique 23 is conditional care. Care is offered, but it comes with terms that aren't spoken up front. They help you, then later use it as leverage. They show affection, then withdraw it when you disagree. They support you, but only if your goals don't threaten their control. They listen, but only if your feelings don't implicate them. The problem isn't that relationships involve reciprocity. The problem is that the reciprocity becomes a trap. You start treating basic needs, attention, kindness, respect, as rewards you must earn. And when care is conditional, you'll tolerate a lot of mistreatment just to keep the conditions satisfied. Technique 24 is the collapse threat. The manipulator signals, directly or indirectly, that if you don't comply, they will fall apart. The threat might be emotional breakdown, rage, self-harm, illness, public humiliation, or ruin. Sometimes it's theatrical. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's implied through past episodes that taught you what happens when you say no. The stakes here are moral coercion. If you believe your boundary will cause a catastrophe, you stop feeling entitled to have a boundary. You become a caretaker first and a person second. And this is where your empathy, which is a strength, gets converted into a leash. Technique 25 is the duty bind. This technique uses your identity as a responsible person against you. They describe your compliance as maturity, loyalty, or integrity. They describe your resistance as selfishness, immaturity, or betrayal. They frame the situation so that the only good person is the person who gives in. You'll hear phrases like, "a real friend would," or "if you cared, you'd," or "after everything, how can you?" The point is to make you argue with your own values until your values collapse into obedience. Technique 26 is guilt stacking. Instead of one guilt claim, they pile several. They bring up the past. They bring up sacrifices. They bring up unrelated favors. They bring up your mistakes. They bring up your tone. They bring up what you always do. The conversation turns into a list that can never be resolved. If you address one item, they add another. If you ask for specifics, they move to feelings. If you offer repair, they shift the goalpost. The effect is exhaustion. And when you're exhausted, you stop asking whether the guilt is fair. You just want it to end. Compliance becomes the fastest exit from the emotional maze. Technique 27 is ambiguous silence. The manipulator doesn't fully withdraw. They partially withdraw. They become slower to respond. They give short answers. They remove warmth. They act distracted. They remain technically present, but emotionally absent. You can't accuse them of leaving, but you can feel the punishment. Ambiguous silence is powerful because it triggers your nervous system without giving your mind a clear event to point to. You can't say you did this because nothing obvious happened. So you turn inward. You blame yourself. You try harder. This is silence used not for reflection, but for training. Technique 28 is preemptive smear. Before you can describe what's happening, the manipulator describes you. They plant a narrative in other people's minds that frames you as unstable, vindictive, jealous, incompetent, or untrustworthy. They do it casually as concern. I'm worried about them. They've been under a lot of stress. They tend to overreact. The story is gentle enough to be believed, but poisonous enough to work. Then, when you finally speak up, you're walking into a room where your credibility has already been negotiated away. The stakes are severe. This is social architecture. Preemptive smear turns future truth into future drama. Technique 29 is confessional bait. The manipulator invites you to share something vulnerable, often under the banner of intimacy, healing, or honesty. They listen closely. They validate. They make it feel safe. But the vulnerability is collected like a file. Later, in conflict, it reappears as a weapon. Your secret becomes an accusation. Your trauma becomes a reason you can't be trusted. Your insecurity becomes a lever. They might not even say it directly. They might imply it. They might threaten to reveal it. They might accidentally mention it to someone else. The point is control through exposure. Once you believe your inner life can be used against you, you become careful. Then you become quiet. Then you become manageable. Technique 30 is the helper trap. This is when the manipulator creates a situation where you must rescue them to feel like yourself. They become helpless at the right moments. They create emergencies that require your intervention. They frame your competence as essential. They make you the only one who can suit them, fix them, understand them, or save them from consequences. This trap works best on conscientious people, people with strong ethics, people who don't like abandoning others. But over time, the helping becomes a lifestyle. Your energy flows outward in one direction. Their responsibility flows inward toward you. You become overfunctioning. They become underfunctioning. And if you ever stop helping, they accuse you of being cruel. Technique 31 is reputation hostage. The manipulator signals that your social standing depends on your compliance. Sometimes it's explicit. If you do this, people will know what you're really like. Sometimes it's implied. A raised eyebrow. A public joke. A subtle threat to tell the truth about you. Sometimes it's institutional. They imply they can affect your job, your references, your role in the group. The point is to tie your identity to their approval. Once your reputation feels fragile, you start making choices to manage optics rather than to live honestly. You start living in a performance, and the manipulator becomes your audience and your judge. Technique 32 is the courtroom flip. This is when every conversation becomes a trial, and you are always on defense. They demand explanations. They interrogate your motives. They treat your feelings as evidence of guilt. They speak as if they are the rational authority and you are the unstable suspect. If you protest, they call it defensiveness. If you stay calm, they call it avoidance. If you cry, they call it manipulation. If you become angry, they call it proof. The structure is rigged. The point isn't understanding. The point is to put you in a permanent posture of justification. Because a person who is always justifying has less energy to evaluate, less energy to leave, and less energy to demand accountability. Technique 33 is the controlled apology. This isn't no apology. It's an apology designed to end the conversation without changing the behavior. It has familiar forms. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry you took it like that. I'm sorry, but you pushed me. The apology is shaped so that responsibility is blurred. The event is minimized. Your reaction becomes the problem. Sometimes the apology is theatrical. Tears, grand promises, sudden tenderness. Not because repair has begun, but because access is threatened. The apology functions like a reset button. It buys time. It restores your hope. It delays consequences. And if you accept it too quickly, the lesson the manipulator learns is simple: performance works. Now, if we step back, you can see how these techniques widen the net. The first set tested your perimeter and built the bond. This set expands into social space. It recruits third parties. It turns the group into a weapon. It turns your conscience into a weapon. It turns silence into punishment. It turns your reputation into a cage. And the emotional experience of it is distinct. You start feeling watched. You start feeling measured. You start feeling like every choice has invisible consequences. That feeling isn't paranoia. It's often your nervous system registering the presence of a system. A system that trains you through reward and withdrawal, through belonging and exclusion, through praise and comparison, through guilt and fear. So the protective move here is to stop debating individual moments and start tracking structure. When a third party is inserted, you ask yourself, does this create clarity or does it create competition? When guilt is invoked, you ask yourself, is there a concrete repair I can make, or is this guilt being used to override my boundaries? When silence arrives, you ask yourself, is this space for reflection, or is this punishment meant to train me? When apologies appear, you ask yourself, do they lead to measurable change, or do they simply restore access and restart the cycle? You can also anchor yourself with one quiet practice: externalizing reality. Not by broadcasting everything, not by starting a war, but by writing down patterns, dates, phrases, and outcomes in a private place. Not to obsess, but to protect your future self from amnesia. Manipulation thrives when each event is isolated. Pattern recognition thrives when events are connected. And there's another protective move that feels small but matters: slowing your responses. Triangulation and blackmail both feed on speed. They want you to reply before you consult your deeper judgment. They want you to soothe before you think. They want you to concede before you check. So you pause. You take your time. You say, I'll get back to you. You refuse to make decisions under threat, whether the threat is rage, collapse, or withdrawal. You treat urgency as information. Because when someone tries to rush your conscience, it usually means they can't win if you're calm. This is also where you begin to understand why people stay trapped. Not because they're naive. Because these techniques don't just pressure you. They reshape your internal world. They make you associate love with anxiety, peace with compliance, and conflict with existential risk. They make you doubt your motives and trust theirs. They make leaving feel immoral. They make speaking feel dangerous. But you're allowed to take your mind back. Not with a dramatic confrontation, necessarily. Often that's the least effective move. You take it back by refusing the rigged frame. You refuse to compete for basic dignity. You refuse to accept guilt that has no clear remedy. You refuse to discuss your reality through a messenger. You refuse to accept silence as a substitute for accountability. And you begin rebuilding your support outside the manipulator's reach, because triangulation depends on controlling the social field. When you have independent witnesses, independent relationships, independent sources of meaning, the triangle collapses. In the next section of our ledger, the techniques will become even more structural. Not just emotional pressure and social games. Reality editing. Physiological leverage. The use of uncertainty to weaken your resistance until you comply just to feel stable again.
Chapter 15, The Strategic Era, Manipulation in Systems. By the time manipulation reaches this stage, it doesn't need charm, it doesn't need intensity. It doesn't even need a convincing lie. It only needs a system. Because a system can do something an individual manipulator can't do as easily. It can make harm feel normal. It can make confusion feel inevitable. It can make your protest feel like you're arguing with reality itself. This is the strategic era. Not a specific century, but a shift in method. The Dark Triad stops relying only on private influence and starts using structures that already have legitimacy. Organizations, policies, procedures, professional language, documentation, chains of command. And if you've ever been caught in one of these dynamics, you know the strange sensation. No one is shouting. No one is explicitly threatening you. Everything is by the book, but you're still losing your footing. The first move is institutional cover. In personal manipulation, the person has to carry the whole performance. In systemic manipulation, the person borrows the institution's authority. They speak as the role, not as themselves. They aren't being cruel. They're following procedure. They aren't isolating you. They're looping in the appropriate parties. They aren't changing the story. They're clarifying expectations. This is why it can feel impossible to argue with. You aren't debating a person anymore. You're debating a structure that has its own vocabulary, its own rituals, its own power to punish. And the most effective part is that the institution often rewards the appearance of order over the reality of fairness. If the paperwork looks clean, the harm is treated as acceptable collateral. This is where plausible deniability becomes a lifestyle. A manipulator in a system learns how to create outcomes without leaving fingerprints. They don't need to say, "I want you gone." They can say, "We're restructuring." They don't need to accuse you directly. They can raise concerns in the right forum. They don't need to threaten you. They can imply consequences through policy. They don't need to lie about what happened. They can simply omit what matters. Omission is one of the quiet weapons of this era. What's missing from the record becomes what didn't exist. And then the record becomes proof that you're overreacting. The second move is information asymmetry. In healthy systems, information flows in ways that keep people oriented. In manipulative systems, information becomes a commodity. It's hoarded, delayed, selectively distributed, and released strategically to force dependency. If someone controls what you know, they control what you can decide. You see this when meetings happen without you, when decisions are made above your level, when expectations change without being written down, when you're given partial instructions and then punished for not following the full set you were never given. When access to key conversations becomes a privilege you must earn through compliance. And over time, you start to behave like a person under surveillance. You over-document, you second-guess, you ask permission for small choices. You become cautious in ways that make you look less confident, which then becomes evidence that you're not fit for the role. That's the trap. The system creates the symptom, then cites the symptom as justification. The third move is professionalism as a weapon. This is where the tone does most of the work. The manipulator stays calm, measured, helpful. They use the language of ethics and standards. They speak in complete sentences. They sound reasonable. And because they sound reasonable, your distress becomes the only unprofessional thing on display. So you start managing your feelings instead of managing the facts. You soften your words. You add disclaimers. You over-explain. You try to sound fair to someone who isn't playing fair. Meanwhile, they keep the upper hand by treating the conversation like a performance of competence. In this era, cruelty becomes procedural. It can be delivered with a smile. A person can sabotage you and still look like the stabilizing force in the room because they know the social rules of credibility. They know which phrases signal authority. They know how to ask questions that sound neutral but lead to one conclusion. They know how to frame their own aggression as concern and your boundaries as resistance. And if you've dealt with this, the hardest part is that you can't point to a single incident. There's no dramatic explosion. It's a slow drift where the ground is moved inch by inch until you're standing somewhere you never agreed to be. This is why the countermove starts with a different kind of clarity. You stop treating the system's language as the only valid language. You translate it back into human terms. When someone says policy, you ask, what outcome does this create for me? When someone says standards, you ask, are these standards consistent or selective? When someone says confidential, you ask, who benefits from silence? When someone says professional, you ask, is this about ethics or about optics? And you begin to understand a subtle but decisive distinction. Order isn't the same as integrity. A system can be orderly and abusive at the same time. In the strategic era, manipulation becomes less personal, which is why it can feel more hopeless. But it also becomes more traceable if you know what to look for. Patterns of exclusion, shifting requirements, unwritten rules, document trails that omit key context, decisions that always move advantage in one direction. So as we move forward into the next set of techniques, keep this frame close. The most dangerous manipulation isn't always emotional. Sometimes it's administrative. And it trains you the same way any other tactic does, by making you doubt your perception, then offering compliance as the only way to feel stable again. Techniques 34 to 51, reality editing and physiological leverage. Technique 34 is the trust installment plan. Instead of demanding everything at once, the manipulator sells you trust in small monthly payments. They do one considerate thing, then another. Nothing dramatic. Just enough that you start building a case in your mind that they're safe. The trap is that you begin using the past as collateral for the present. When something feels off later, you remember the earlier kindness and you hesitate. You soften your confrontation. You give them the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes that's wise. But in this tactic, the earlier kindness wasn't generosity. It was an investment. A person using a trust installment plan doesn't need to be perfect. They only need to be consistent enough that you start protecting their image for them. You become the one who says they wouldn't do that. You become their alibi inside your own mind. What matters isn't that someone did something good. It's whether the good is used to buy immunity from accountability. Technique 35 is crisis manufacturing. This isn't just chaos. It's a pattern where instability appears at strategic moments, usually when you're about to pull away, set a boundary, or demand clarity. Suddenly, there's an emergency. A breakdown, a conflict with someone else, a health scare, a threat from the outside world, something that forces you to drop your needs and focus on theirs. Crisis manufacturing doesn't have to be fully invented. It can be exaggerated. It can be created by poor decisions, then presented as fate. It can be an avoidable problem that they refuse to solve until you rescue them. The goal is simple: make the relationship feel like a triage unit. When you're always responding to emergencies, you don't have time to evaluate patterns. You don't have time to consult your values. You become reactive. And reactivity is a state where consent gets sloppy. You agree to things because the alternative feels like disaster. If you've lived near this, you might recognize the strange emotional hangover afterward. You feel drained, but you also feel bonded. Because intensity, again, can imitate depth, the crisis becomes a shared story. You confuse your exhaustion with commitment. Technique 36 is spotlight theft. This is when your moment becomes their moment. You share a success, and they redirect attention to their contribution, their struggle, their sacrifice. You share pain, and they pivot to their pain, often larger, often more urgent. You're ill, and they become the most wounded person in the room. You get recognition, and they produce a quiet grievance that you didn't recognize them first. Spotlight theft works because it feels petty to accuse someone of it. It feels small, almost embarrassing to say out loud. So you swallow it. You become more careful about sharing. You start dimming yourself preemptively to avoid the discomfort of being interrupted or outshone. Over time, the result is serious. Your inner life becomes private, not because you prefer privacy, but because sharing has been trained to feel costly. And the manipulator achieves something subtle. They become the only fully visible person, the only person allowed to have a central experience. Technique 37 is the attention tax. In this tactic, normal interaction becomes an economy. If you spend time with friends, you pay for it later with guilt, punishment, or emotional withdrawal. If you focus on work, you pay with accusations of neglect. If you enjoy something alone, you pay with suspicion. The manipulator doesn't necessarily forbid these things, they just make them expensive. So you start budgeting your life around their reactions. You don't choose what matters to you. You choose what costs the least conflict. And slowly you become a person living under a private tariff system. Your joy is audited. Your freedom has fees. This is one of the clearest signs that the relationship has shifted from mutuality to management. Because in mutuality, two people negotiate needs. In management, one person sets the price and the other person pays. Technique 38 is the debt narrative. This is where the manipulator keeps a ledger you never agreed to. They remember every favor, every sacrifice, every moment they stood by you. And the story is always told as if you are behind on payments. You are always in arrears. You are always about to be exposed as ungrateful. Sometimes the debt narrative is tied to real sacrifices. But the manipulation is that the sacrifices were never freely offered. They were offered to create entitlement. The debt narrative is especially corrosive because it rewrites your conscience. You start relating to them not as an equal person but as a creditor. And once you feel indebted, you stop asking whether your needs matter. You focus on earning forgiveness for a debt that can't be cleared. Technique 39 is the grooming ladder. Grooming is often discussed in the context of sexual exploitation, but the structure appears in many domains: workplace exploitation, spiritual manipulation, financial extraction, emotional dependency. The ladder is incremental. Each step is plausible. Each step sets the stage for the next. It begins with access, then trust, then specialness, then secrecy, then boundary violations reframed as normal, then isolation, then the major ask. The reason the ladder works is because each step feels small, and the person can point to your previous consent as proof that you're okay with it. You didn't mind before. You agreed to this. You said you trusted me. But consent to one step is not consent to the next. The grooming ladder turns your past cooperation into a weapon against your present clarity. Now we shift into a different cluster, not grooming and attention, but narrative domination. This is where reality itself is edited, not just what happened, but what it meant. Technique 40 is motive rewriting. When you speak about your own intention, the manipulator corrects you. You say, "I needed space." They say, "You wanted to punish me." You say, "I was overwhelmed." They say, "You were being dramatic." You say, "I didn't like the way you spoke to me." They say, "You were trying to control me." Motive rewriting is powerful because your motives are the only part of your inner life you should have authority over. When that authority is taken, you lose the ability to narrate yourself. And if you can't narrate yourself, you become easier to define. Over time, you may notice something disturbing. You start explaining yourself in their language. You start pre-defending against accusations they haven't made yet. You become a person who is always clarifying, always proving, always trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Technique 41 is history revision. This is broader than gaslighting. It's not just denying a single event, it's rewriting the entire arc. They retell your relationship as if they were always the stable one and you were always the problem. They erase their own aggression and emphasize your reactions. They highlight the moments you were imperfect and treat their own imperfections as, quote, context. History revision often happens after the manipulator has already changed the rules. They need the past to match the present. Because if the past stays true, their current demands look unreasonable. So they edit. They turn your earlier boundaries into phase you went through. They turn your earlier achievements into luck. They turn your earlier pain into overreaction. They make the story of you smaller so they can occupy more space. And what's dangerous is that memory is social. Humans remember partly through conversation. If you live inside someone else's retelling long enough, your own recall can weaken. Not because you're foolish, but because your mind is trying to reduce conflict. It tries to find the version of the past that makes the present survivable. Technique 42 is value hijacking. The manipulator learns what you care about, then uses it as a control handle. If you value compassion, they frame your boundaries as cruelty. If you value honesty, they force confessions that are actually submissions. If you value growth, they frame tolerating abuse as healing. If you value loyalty, they frame leaving as betrayal no matter what they've done. Value hijacking works because it doesn't attack you directly. It recruits the best parts of you and turns them into enforcement. You become your own prison guard, believing you're being moral while you're being drained. Technique 43 is the false principle. This is when the manipulator introduces a rule that sounds ethical but functions as a trap. Healthy relationships have no secrets, therefore you must surrender privacy. If you loved me, you'd trust me, therefore you must accept uncertainty. Real friends always show up, therefore you must abandon your needs. Families stick together, therefore you must tolerate harm. The rule sounds noble because it's vaguely true in healthy contexts. But here, it's applied without nuance, without reciprocity, without regard for safety. The manipulator uses a principle as a club, then acts offended when you flinch. Technique 44 is the forced binary. You're told there are only two options, and both serve the manipulator. Either you agree now, or you don't care. Either you forgive immediately, or you're bitter. Either you stay close, or you're abandoning them. Either you accept their interpretation or you're attacking them. Forced binaries work because the human mind seeks closure. When options are narrowed, you choose within the frame offered. You forget to ask the quiet third option, what if I refuse the frame entirely? But refusing the frame requires stability, and stability is exactly what these tactics aim to erode. Technique 45 is narrative saturation. This is when the manipulator talks so much, so intensely, and with such confidence that your mind can't keep up. The details pile up, the stories branch, the explanations multiply. Every point you make is met with 3 counterpoints and a new tangent. Narrative saturation can look like intelligence. It can look like passion, but the effect is cognitive fatigue. Once you're fatigued, you lose the ability to track contradictions. You stop insisting on clarity. You start conceding just to end the monologue, and the manipulator learns that volume equals victory. A quiet sign is how you feel afterward, not persuaded, just tired, as if you were in a room with no air. Now we move to the third cluster, uncertainty and physiology. This is where manipulation stops being only psychological and starts becoming bodily. Because your nervous system is part of the decision-making process. If your body is destabilized, your boundaries become negotiable. Technique 46 is mixed messages. They say one thing and do another. They praise you, then punish you for the same behavior. They promise, then forget. They flirt with closeness, then withdraw when you respond. Mixed messages create cognitive dissonance. Your mind tries to resolve the contradiction by searching for the hidden rule. You keep engaging because you believe the confusion is your failure to understand, not their refusal to be consistent. This also creates a dependency loop. If the manipulator is sometimes warm and sometimes cold, you keep hoping the warmth returns. The relationship becomes a weather system you try to predict. Technique 47 is rule fog escalation. We've already touched rule fog in incremental contradiction. Here it becomes more deliberate. The manipulator introduces rules that aren't written. They punish you for not knowing them. Then they deny the rules existed. Then they enforce new rules. The aim is not just control, it's learned helplessness. When you can't predict what will be rewarded or punished, you stop acting from values. You act from fear. You become cautious, deferential, apologetic. You check their mood before you speak. You become skilled at anticipating them, which feels like intimacy, but is actually surveillance. And the tragedy is that this skill is rewarded. The more you adapt to their fog, the less overt cruelty they need. You're already steering around landmines. Technique 48 is the sleep squeeze. Sleep disruption doesn't have to be obvious to be effective. It can be late-night arguments that can't wait. It can be texts that demand immediate response. It can be morning crises, time to ruin your day. It can be noise, interruptions, or keeping you emotionally activated so you can't settle. When sleep goes, the mind loses executive function. You become more impulsive, more emotional, less capable of complex judgment. Your ability to hold boundaries weakens, not because you stopped caring, but because your brain is depleted. This tactic is particularly dangerous because it can be masked as intimacy. Let's talk all night. I miss you. I'm spiraling. It can be masked as crisis. This is urgent, but repeated over time, it functions as a compliance tool. A tired person is easier to steer. Technique 49 is the appetite and rhythm disturbance. Not everyone experiences this the same way, but the pattern is familiar. Meals become irregular. You eat too little because anxiety kills hunger, or too much because stress seeks comfort. Your routines collapse. Your gym, your walks, your quiet habits that used to anchor you start disappearing. Some manipulators actively interfere with your routines. They mock them. They interrupt them. They create plans that conflict. They frame your self-care as selfish. Others don't need to interfere directly. They just keep you emotionally dysregulated, and your routines fall apart on their own. Either way, the outcome is the same. When your rhythm breaks, your identity softens, you become less you, and when you are less you, you become easier to reshape. Technique 50 is sensory overwhelm. This can look like constant stimulation, loud environments, non-stop social plans, crowded schedules, endless conversation. Or it can look like the opposite, harsh silence, sudden isolation, long hours without meaningful interaction. The point is to keep your nervous system out of the window where you think clearly. When you're overwhelmed, you simplify. You choose whatever reduces immediate discomfort. You say yes to end pressure. You agree to false narratives because arguing costs too much energy. Some people experience this as walking through life slightly dissociated, as if they're watching themselves comply. That's not weakness. It's the nervous system trying to protect itself by going numb. But numbness is also a state where you can't easily access your own no. Technique 51 is the health mirror reversal. This is when your body's stress response is used as evidence that you are the problem. You become anxious, therefore you're unstable. You can't sleep, therefore you're irrational. You're exhausted, therefore you're incompetent. You cry, therefore you're manipulative. The manipulator pressures you until your nervous system reacts, then points to the reaction as proof that you can't be trusted. It's elegant in a grim way. It creates the symptom, then indicts you for having it. And if you accept that indictment, you stop listening to your body as information. You start treating your body as an enemy. You become more dependent on their interpretation because yours feels unreliable. So if we step back, what have these techniques done? They've moved from shaping your choices to shaping your perception of yourself. Trust is built as an investment. Crisis keeps you reactive. Attention is taxed. Debt is created. Grooming moves you step by step. Then reality is edited through motives, history, and values. Finally, your physiology is destabilized, so you can't hold the line even when you see what's happening. This is why the strategic era feels so difficult to fight. You aren't only disagreeing with a person, you're trying to regain traction inside your own mind and body. The countermove here is not cleverness, it's stabilization. You protect sleep as if it's a boundary. You return to routines not as productivity, but as identity preservation. You reduce urgency by delaying decisions. You insist on written clarity when rules keep shifting. You check motives by asking simple questions. What do they gain if I accept this story about myself? And you treat your stress signals as data, not as shame. If your body spikes every time you receive a message from someone, that's information. If you feel calm when they're gone and tense when they return, that's information. The point isn't to panic. The point is to stop arguing with your own nervous system. Because manipulation depends on one quiet victory, making you distrust your internal signals more than you distrust their behavior. In the next set of techniques, we'll move even deeper into the machinery of credibility and extraction. Not just destabilizing you, but building systems where they look trustworthy while you look unstable, and where the cost of resisting keeps rising.
Chapter 16, The Dark Empath, the Most Dangerous Mirror. After the strategic era, you might expect the next threat to look harsher, more obvious, more openly predatory. But sometimes the next escalation is softer. It's someone who understands you. Not in the way a close friend understands you, with shared history and earned trust. In a different way. They notice micro-expressions. They read the room quickly. They can tell when you're anxious before you admit it to yourself. They can describe your wounds with surprising accuracy. And when they speak, you feel seen. That's the doorway. The term dark empath is often used online with more confidence than the research warrants, so we should hold it carefully. It isn't a formal clinical diagnosis. It's a popular label for a specific configuration people report encountering. High cognitive empathy, paired with darker traits like manipulation, callousness, or narcissistic and Machiavellian patterns. So we're not treating it as a category you can measure cleanly with a single test. We're treating it as a pattern you can recognize. The paradox is simple. Empathy, which we usually think of as protection, becomes a weapon when it's disconnected from care. There's a difference between affective empathy and cognitive empathy. Affective empathy is emotional resonance, feeling something of what someone else feels. Cognitive empathy is perspective-taking, understanding what someone else feels and why without necessarily sharing it. A dark empath, in this framing, leans hard on the cognitive side. They understand the map, but they don't consistently honor the territory. They can name what you're experiencing, but the naming isn't for comfort. It's for influence. That's why this chapter belongs here, after reality editing and physiological leverage. Because if you've been destabilized, if you're tired, if your internal signals feel unreliable, the person who can read you becomes incredibly compelling. Their accuracy feels like safety. But accuracy can also be predation with better manners. The stakes in this chapter are not just emotional harm. The stakes are something quieter. You losing trust in your own self-interpretation because someone else is interpreting you faster than you can. This kind of person doesn't always need to gaslight you by denying events. They can do it by narrating your inner life with such confidence that you start deferring. You stop saying, "I think," and start saying, "Maybe you're right." Strategic empathy is the core move here. You'll notice it in how they gather data. They ask the right questions early. Not too many at once, just enough to learn your attachment style, your guilt triggers, your conflicts with authority, your fear of being misunderstood. They don't interrogate you, they invite you. And because it feels like intimacy, you cooperate. Then you'll notice it in how they time their interventions. They don't push when you're strong. They push when you're tender. After a hard day, after you've shared something vulnerable, after you've made a mistake and already feel ashamed, they understand your emotional weather, and they wait for the low-pressure system. In that moment, their suggestion doesn't feel like control, it feels like guidance. A simple analogy helps. Think of a locksmith. The locksmith doesn't break the door down. They study the lock, then use the smallest movement that opens it. The door isn't destroyed, it's opened politely. And that politeness is what makes you underestimate what just happened. This is why the dark empath can feel like the best listener you've ever met, right up until you notice you're making choices you don't remember agreeing to. The most disorienting version is when they combine empathy with moral language. They frame their influence as healing. They speak about growth, boundaries, trauma, attachment. They use therapeutic vocabulary, not necessarily because they understand it deeply, but because it gives them a kind of authority. If you resist, they don't just say you're wrong. They say you're unintegrated. They suggest you're acting from fear, not truth. They imply your boundary is a defense mechanism. They offer an interpretation that makes your no sound like a symptom. And because they can sometimes describe your inner life accurately, it's hard to argue. You start wondering if your resistance really is avoidance. You start confusing discernment with pathology. That's the most dangerous mirror. Not because they reflect you, because they reflect you selectively in a way that steers you toward what benefits them. Now there's another disguise that makes this pattern harder to detect, the extrovert's mask. We often associate manipulation with secrecy and coldness, but an outgoing person can manipulate through visibility. They know people, they connect quickly, they remember names, they're socially generous in ways that make them look safe. They become the hub, and if they're the hub, they control the narrative. They can shape what others think of you with small comments and subtle framing, all while appearing supportive. They can praise you in public, then correct you in private. They can make you feel socially held, while quietly training you to stay aligned with their expectations. This is where the danger shifts from individual tactics to atmosphere. You're not only influenced by what they say, you're influenced by the feeling that they are socially protected and you are socially exposed. A dark empath can also create a peculiar bond by offering what looks like accountability. They'll admit flaws, they'll share hard truths about themselves, they'll talk about their shadow, and it can be real. But even self-disclosure can be tactical. It establishes them as honest and self-aware, which makes you less likely to question them later. It also invites you to reciprocate, which gives them more material. So the question isn't, do they understand emotions? The question is, what do they do with what they understand? Because empathy without care often leads to one consistent outcome. You feel known, but you don't feel free. If you're listening for protection, there are a few signals worth tracking, not as proof, as prompts. Do they use your vulnerabilities later, even gently, to win arguments? Do they interpret your motives more than they ask about them? Do you feel subtly corrected when you disagree, as if disagreement is immaturity? Do you feel you must stay emotionally legible to them to keep the relationship stable? And most importantly, do you find yourself performing your pain in the right way because they respond only to the acceptable version of your emotion? A caring person can handle your complexity. A strategic person prefers your predictability. The reason we place the dark empath here is that it bridges two worlds. It has the warmth and emotional attunement that makes you lower your guard, and the darker incentive structure that makes the lowering of your guard profitable. And once you see that combination clearly, you stop confusing being understood with being safe. Next, we return to the ledger again. Because the moment someone can borrow credibility through empathy, the next move is usually extraction. Resources, control, reputation, and consent pulled from you under the banner of connection. Techniques 52 to 69, credibility and extraction. If you've followed the story this far, you can feel the shift. Early techniques tested your boundaries, then built attachment, then edited reality, then destabilized your body. And now, after the dark empath, there's a new requirement for the manipulator. They need to look legitimate. Because once you've been hurt, you start asking questions. Once you've been confused, you start looking for patterns. Once your nervous system has learned the taste of danger, you become harder to rush. So the next tactics don't just pressure you. They build credibility. And then they use that credibility to extract time, money, access, labor, secrecy, and loyalty, often without ever asking directly. We'll split this ledger into two clusters. First, bureaucratic control, techniques that weaponize documents, procedures, and, quote, professional norms. Second, status and accountability, techniques that protect the manipulator's image while shifting blame, stealing credit, and trapping you in endless repair. Technique 52 is document drift. This is when the record slowly changes, in small ways, until it no longer matches what you lived. A meeting summary omits a promise that mattered. A written agreement becomes a draft. A task list is updated without discussion. A performance metric is redefined after the fact. A timeline gets quietly adjusted so that delays look like your fault. Document drift rarely looks like a lie in isolation. It looks like editing. But the impact is real, because when the paper shifts, reality shifts with it. And if you challenge it, you're treated as emotional, while the document is treated as objective. The person isn't arguing with you anymore, they're pointing at the file. The extraction here is subtle. You begin spending your energy defending your memory against the record. And once you're defending, you're not advancing. You're not negotiating. You're not leaving. You're trying to prove you exist. Technique 53 is the policy citation trap. This is when a manipulator cites policy like scripture. Not to clarify expectations, but to end conversation. They quote rules selectively. They present their interpretation as the only interpretation. They lean on vague wording. They emphasize, quote, compliance, while ignoring purpose. They use policy to create fear. Fear of being reported, fear of consequences, fear of looking incompetent for not knowing the rules. The trap works because most people don't want trouble. Most people don't want to be the person making things difficult. So you comply. And later, when you finally look up the policy yourself, you may realize it didn't require what you were told it required. Or it required reciprocity that was never offered. Or it allowed discretion, and discretion was used only against you. The extraction is obedience under a false authority. Technique 54 is gate-kept communication. In this tactic, access becomes a control point. The manipulator positions themselves as the necessary conduit to important information or people. Messages must pass through them. Introductions must be approved by them. Decisions must be filtered by them. They offer to handle it so you don't have to, and at first it can feel like support. But then you notice a pattern. Conversations happen without you. You're quoted inaccurately. Your questions arrive softened. Your concerns arrive sharpened. Your position is represented in a way that benefits the gatekeeper's agenda. And if you try to bypass them, if you talk directly to the person you're supposed to talk to, you're accused of disrespect, poor process, or betrayal. You're told you're going around them. What's really happening is that they're controlling the flow so they can control the narrative. The extraction here is your autonomy, your ability to speak for yourself. Technique 55 is the process smokescreen. This one sounds clean. We need to follow process. Let's be methodical. Let's not rush. Again, process can be healthy. It prevents chaos. It protects fairness. But as a tactic, process is used to delay accountability until the moment passes. A complaint is acknowledged, then buried in procedure. A decision is postponed until the consequences become irreversible. A conflict is routed into committees, review cycles, meetings that lead to more meetings. The person uses the appearance of diligence to avoid the substance of change. And while you wait, the extraction continues. Your time, your attention, your emotional bandwidth. You're kept in the hallway of resolution, forever approaching the door that never opens. Technique 56 is the moving inbox. This is an information control tactic designed to exhaust you. Communication shifts platforms. Instructions arrive in fragments. Key details are delivered verbally and later denied. Deadlines change without clear confirmation. The manipulator responds just enough to keep you engaged, but not enough to stabilize the work. In personal relationships, it can look like constant clarifying conversations that never produce clarity. In professional settings, it can look like tasking you without documentation, then demanding documentation when you can't defend yourself. The moving inbox keeps you chasing. And the chase is the point. Because a person who is always catching up doesn't have time to notice they're being led in circles. Technique 57 is selective escalation. This is when the manipulator chooses which conflicts to take up the chain and which to keep private, based on what benefits them. If you raise an issue that threatens their image, they keep it informal. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. If you resist their demand, they suddenly formalize it. They email, they document, they copy people. They create an official tone that signals, quietly, that you're now under scrutiny. Selective escalation teaches you a lesson. Resistance has a cost. It also teaches everyone watching that the manipulator has the system on their side, even if they don't, because the act of escalation itself looks like authority. The extraction is your willingness to push back. Technique 58 is compliance theater. This is where the manipulator performs responsibility without practicing it. They schedule the meeting, they create the agenda, they use phrases like alignment, transparency, accountability. They nod. They repeat your concern back to you. They promise a follow-up. They offer an action plan. But then nothing changes. Or the action plan is designed to fail. Or it's vague enough to be unmeasurable. Or it shifts responsibility onto you. Or it requires you to do the labor of fixing the harm they caused. Compliance theater isn't meant to solve. It's meant to reset the emotional temperature. It's meant to calm your nervous system just enough that you stop escalating, stop reporting, stop leaving. The extraction here is your hope, because hope keeps you in the loop. Technique 59 is the audit inversion. This is when the person who creates chaos demands that you prove you're stable. They ask you for evidence, while offering none. They demand that you document your claims, while refusing to document theirs. They ask you to explain your feelings rationally, as if rationality is a court requirement, while they hide their own motives behind professionalism. In relationships, this looks like a partner who violates boundaries and then asks you to justify why you have boundaries at all. In workplaces, it looks like a leader who changes expectations and then asks you to prove you were ever told something different. The inversion is simple: you become the one under investigation. And once you accept that role, you start behaving like a defendant, not a person with agency. Technique 60 is procedural isolation. This is when the manipulator uses rules to separate you from support. They insist conversations must happen one-on-one to keep it clean. They discourage you from bringing a witness to avoid drama. They schedule meetings when you can't have an advocate. They forbid you from sharing details, framing it as confidentiality, while they share their version freely under the same confidentiality umbrella. Procedural isolation is especially effective because it can be framed as maturity. Adults handle things privately, but privacy is not neutral when one person has more power, more credibility, more practiced language. The extraction is your safety, your ability to reality check. Now we pivot into the second cluster: status and accountability. This is where the manipulator isn't just controlling the system. They're controlling the story of who deserves trust. Technique 61 is credit theft. It doesn't always look like theft. It can look like speaking for the team. You did the work, and they present it. You made the connection, and they claim the relationship. You solved the problem, and they frame it as their leadership. Sometimes they don't even deny your contribution, they just position it as secondary. You helped. They drove. You supported. They delivered. The reason this matters in a documentary about manipulation is that credit is not just praise. Credit is leverage. It affects your reputation, your opportunities, your bargaining power. When your credit is siphoned, your future options shrink. And a person with dark traits understands this instinctively. If you have fewer options, you're easier to keep. Technique 62 is competence erosion. This is the slow undermining of your confidence, targeted at areas where you used to feel strong. They correct you in front of others, lightly, with a smile. They question your memory in ways that sound like curiosity. They double-check your work with a tone that implies you're careless. They bring up old mistakes when you try to lead. They praise you for being reliable only when you comply, and treat initiative as arrogance. Over time, you start hesitating. You stop trusting your judgment. You stop speaking up because the cost of being questioned feels higher than the value of being right. This isn't about making you less skilled. It's about making you less certain. Because a certain person is harder to steer. Technique 63 is the moral high ground grab. The manipulator frames their preferences as ethics. They don't say, "I want it my way." They say, "This is the right way." They don't say, "I'm uncomfortable with your independence." They say, "I'm worried about your priorities." They don't say, "I want control." They say, "I'm trying to protect what matters." The moral high ground grab is powerful because it makes disagreement feel like wrongdoing. You aren't just challenging a person, you're challenging virtue. And the moment virtue enters, people get quiet. This tactic recruits the audience. It makes onlookers hesitant to defend you, because defending you might look like defending something unethical. Meanwhile, you're pressured to prove you're good, which is an unwinnable game. Goodness is not a measurable deliverable. The extraction here is your right to disagree without being condemned. Technique 64 is the accountability mirage. This is when the manipulator appears self-reflective, but only in ways that preserve power. They admit flaws that don't cost them anything. "I'm too hard on myself. I care too much. I'm blunt." These admissions don't change their behavior. They change your perception. They make you think, they're aware, so they must be trying. Sometimes they offer accountability language. "I hear you. I take that seriously. I own my part." But when you look for the part they actually own, it's abstract. It's foggy. It's a gesture without a transfer of responsibility. The mirage is that you feel like progress is happening. But what's really happening is containment. Your anger is being managed. Your urgency is being reduced. The extraction is time. Time you could have used to leave, to report, to reorient. Technique 65 is DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. It's a pattern that shows up when you confront harm. First, deny, "That didn't happen," or "You're exaggerating," or "That's not what I meant." Then, attack, "You're always trying to start something," or "You're unstable," or "You're impossible to please." Then, reverse, suddenly they're the one being mistreated. Your complaint becomes their suffering. They describe themselves as targeted, misunderstood, attacked for just trying. They reframe your boundary as cruelty. DARVO works because it pulls you out of your original claim and into defense. You forget what you were addressing. You start comforting them, clarifying, apologizing for your tone, reassuring them that you don't think they're a bad person. And in that moment, accountability is gone. The extraction here is the conversation itself. The truth is stolen and replaced with a drama where they are the injured party. Technique 66 is apology theater. We've already seen controlled apologies earlier. This is the more advanced version, where the apology is staged not for you, but for the audience. The manipulator offers remorse with the right performance cues. A heavy sigh, a softer voice, a confession timed to look courageous, a public statement that implies humility. But watch the structure. The apology focuses on intent, not impact. It emphasizes how hard this is for them. It uses passive language. Mistakes were made. Things happened. It avoids clear acknowledgement of the behavior. It often includes a request for closure. Can we move forward? Closure is offered like a moral duty, as if your ongoing discomfort is the real problem. Apology theater extracts your silence. If you keep speaking after an apology, you look unforgiving. You look obsessive. The audience wants resolution, and the manipulator offers it as a prop. Technique 67 is the scapegoat handoff. This is when consequences approach, and someone else becomes the sacrifice. The manipulator redirects blame onto a subordinate, a partner, a former ally, a vague miscommunication, a flawed process. If they're cornered, they produce a new narrative where they were misled, unsupported, or forced into a decision. The scapegoat is often chosen for convenience, someone with less credibility, less power, less social protection. And if you are the scapegoat, the experience is surreal. You watch the story bend around you, turning you into the reason everything went wrong, even as you recognize the system was designed. The extraction is safety again. The manipulator buys their own survival by selling yours. Technique 68 is the reasonable request squeeze. This is when the manipulator asks for something that is framed as small, fair, and normal, but it sits on top of all the conditioning that came before. It might be just a little extra time, just a small loan, just access to your account, just one more favor, just secrecy, just moving in, just signing something. The request is designed to be hard to refuse without appearing rude. And if you've already been trained by guilt, by urgency, by fear of conflict, you feel the familiar internal pull, don't make this a big deal. But the thing is, the request is rarely the point. The point is what it establishes: a new precedent, a new entitlement, a new expectation of access. The extraction is whatever you hand over, and the precedent that makes the next handoff easier. Technique 69 is the exit toll. This is what happens when you try to step away. The manipulator creates a cost for leaving. Sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's social. Sometimes it's legal, financial, or procedural. They threaten to tell a story about you. They imply retaliation. They withhold property, information, access, or closure. They demand one final conversation, one final meeting, one final explanation, structured so they can reassert the frame. They create obstacles that aren't necessary, but they are exhausting. The exit toll is meant to do one thing: make leaving feel harder than staying. And if you've never been in this situation, you might think, I would just leave. But fatigue is persuasive. Shame is persuasive. Social threat is persuasive. People stay because their nervous system is trying to avoid a new war. So here's the thread connecting techniques 52 through 69. These aren't just ways to win arguments. They are ways to manufacture legitimacy. Documents shift, policies are cited, access is controlled. Process becomes a fog machine. Credibility is stolen and redistributed. Accountability becomes performance. Blame becomes a hot potato. And when you finally try to leave, you're charged a fee. This is why people say, afterward, I don't know how it happened. It happened through structure. A manipulative person doesn't need you to believe every lie. They only need you to feel uncertain enough, tired enough, and socially alone enough that you stop insisting on reality. They need you to defer, to delay, to doubt. So the counter move here isn't a clever comeback. It's the restoration of independent credibility. You get things in writing when the story keeps shifting. You preserve your own records when documents drift. You ask for specific policy language instead of accepting policy as a threat. You remove the gatekeeper when you can, by speaking directly and calmly. You rebuild witnesses, not as a mob, but as reality anchors, trusted people who can confirm what you've experienced. And when Darvo appears, you treat it as a signal, not a debate. You return to the original claim. You don't accept the role reversal. You don't become the defendant in a trial you didn't start. Because this cluster is about extraction. And the simplest way to reduce extraction is to stop paying in the currency the manipulator prefers: confusion, urgency, guilt, and silence. From here, the ledger will turn darker again, not always louder, but more predatory. We're moving toward calibration, group games, containment, and recapture. The tactics that appear when the person no longer needs your cooperation to get what they want, and begins treating your autonomy as the obstacle.
Chapter 17, The Future of the Shadowed Mind. A heavy door closes, and you hear the soft mechanical click of a lock turning. It isn't dramatic, it's administrative. It's the sound of access being decided somewhere out of view. That sound matters, because the future of manipulation looks less like a confrontation, and more like a filter, less like a villain, more like a system that quietly learns you, predicts you, and then nudges you. We've moved through myths, courts, clinics, measurement, circuitry, and a long ledger of techniques. Now we step into the digital arena, where those same patterns don't disappear, they scale. And the question isn't whether manipulation will exist online. It already does. The question is what happens when the tools become faster than your conscious mind. The first shift is that influence becomes personalized at a distance. In older settings, a manipulator had to watch you directly. They had to study your face, your tone, your social position, your guilt triggers. They had to gather data through conversation, observation, and repetition. In the digital environment, much of that observation is outsourced. Your clicks, your pauses, your searches, your late-night scrolling patterns, your purchasing habits, your social graph, these become a behavioral portrait. Not a portrait of your soul, a portrait of your predictability. And predictability is enough to exploit. The second shift is that manipulation becomes ambient. In a one-on-one dynamic, you can often point to the person who is destabilizing you. Even if they deny it, you know where the pressure is coming from. In a digital context, pressure is distributed. You are pulled by feeds, notifications, algorithmic recommendations, targeted messages, and the subtle shaping of what you see and what you never see. It's harder to name. That's why it's harder to resist. The third shift is that anonymity changes the cost of cruelty. When social consequences are immediate, many people restrain impulses they might otherwise indulge. But when you can disappear behind a handle, cruelty becomes easier to rehearse. It becomes entertainment. It becomes a form of status inside small subcultures where humiliation is currency. Everyday sadism in this environment doesn't need physical proximity. It needs a target and an audience. And the audience is built in. Now, we should be careful here, because not every algorithm is designed to manipulate in the same way, and not every person using a platform is predatory. But the structure of these systems often rewards attention, and attention is frequently captured by intensity, fear, anger, outrage, envy, obsession, longing. Those are emotional states that narrow your thinking. And a narrowed mind is easier to lead. This is where Dark Triad patterns find new leverage. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on visibility and validation. Online, validation can be quantified and delivered in bursts. That matters, because intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest conditioning schedules we've talked about. A person can post, wait, refresh, and feel their nervous system spike or settle based on feedback. Status becomes a daily blood test, and contempt becomes a defense against any signal of decline. Machiavellian dynamics thrive on planning, information control, and plausible deniability. Online, information control can mean selective screenshots, edited clips, curated timelines, and strategic leaks. Plausible deniability can mean disappearing messages, ambiguous posts, just asking questions, or spreading doubt without making a claim you can pin down. The manipulator doesn't need to win on facts. They only need to keep reality contested long enough to achieve their goal. Psychopathic dynamics thrive on access without attachment, on novelty, and on low internal consequence. Online, access is abundant. You can enter and exit communities quickly. You can ghost without explanation. You can run parallel conversations with minimal friction. If remorse is already low, the digital environment doesn't create it. It removes the few external breaks that might have compensated for it. And when these patterns mix with scalable tools, the future looks like micro-targeted influence. Not always political, not always commercial, sometimes relational. You can already see early versions. Someone learns which posts make you respond, what time you're most lonely, what topics make you defensive, what moral language makes you soften. They don't need to know you in full. They only need to know the parts of you that are easy to pull. This leads to a quieter threat, the automation of your triggers. A human manipulator gets tired. They make mistakes. They lose patience. But systems can run experiments endlessly. They can test what keeps you engaged. They can test what makes you click. They can test what makes you comply. And while you're living your life, the system is learning which version of you is most steerable. Here's the uncomfortable part. When manipulation is personalized, you stop sharing a common reality with the people around you. Two people can live in the same town and still inhabit different information climates, different fears, different moral outrages, different narratives about who is dangerous and who is trustworthy. Triangulation becomes structural because social proof can be manufactured at scale. False consensus becomes easy because it can be simulated. You can be shown a crowd that agrees whether or not that crowd represents anything outside the screen. And because the signals arrive constantly, you don't get the silence you need to think. So the protective question changes. It's no longer only, is this person manipulating me? It becomes, what is shaping my attention and why? Because attention is the entry point. If someone can guide what you notice, they can guide what you feel. If they can guide what you feel, they can guide what you do. The future of the shadowed mind isn't only about darker people. It's also about environments that amplify darker incentives. And the simplest counter-move is a return to friction. Friction is what slows automatic behavior. You create space between stimulus and response. You turn off non-essential alerts. You reduce late-night exposure to emotionally loaded content. You stop making decisions when your nervous system is activated. You check claims across sources when someone is trying to rush you into certainty. You treat virality as a signal of spread, not truth. You also rebuild something analog, reality anchors. A consistent routine, a trusted human conversation, a private record of what happened, a body that sleeps. A life that exists off-screen. Because when the door closes and the lock turns, the most important thing you can still control is whether your mind stays inside the room someone else built for you. Technique 70 to 100, Predation and Final Exit. By this point in the documentary, you can feel how the latter works. It starts with tiny perimeter tests, it moves into attachment leverage, then it recruits third parties, paperwork, systems, and credibility. It edits reality, then it edits your body's ability to resist, and when you finally begin to restabilize, the tactics don't stop. They adapt. These next techniques belong to a later phase, not later in time, but later in the cycle. They show up when the manipulator either believes you're captured or senses you're slipping away. They're about predation, containment, and the management of your exit. Some of these will sound overt, others will sound like concern, but the common thread is simple. Your autonomy becomes the obstacle. So we'll move through them in clusters, the way they usually occur in real life. Technique 70 is vulnerability scanning. This is when the manipulator studies you the way a locksmith studies a door, not to admire the craftsmanship, to find the easiest entry. They pay close attention to what you apologize for, what you defend without being accused, what you tolerate with a strained smile, what you rationalize, what you hide. They also watch your environment. Are you isolated? Are you new to a city? Are you in conflict with family? Are you overwhelmed at work? Are you grieving? Are you short on money? Are you longing for belonging? Vulnerability scanning isn't always conscious, but it's consistent, and the purpose is always selection. A predatory person often doesn't need to overpower you. They just need to choose you at a time when your resources are low. Technique 71 is boundary erosion through humor. The violation arrives disguised as play. A jab, a tease, a comment that lands too close to a private wound, a joke that makes your body tense while your face tries to stay polite. If you react, you're told you can't take a joke. If you don't react, the person learns that comedy is a battering ram that won't be punished. This tactic works because it weaponizes a social virtue, being easy to be around. You're pressured to be flexible, relaxed, good-natured. And that pressure becomes the cover under which disrespect can repeat. Over time, the jokes become a training ground. They teach you which pain you're expected to swallow quietly. Technique 72 is the tiny consent trap. The manipulator seeks a micro-agreement that seems harmless because it doesn't feel like a real choice. It can be sitting closer than you want, sharing a private detail you'd rather keep private, allowing a small intrusion into your time, accepting a minor breach of privacy, laughing at something that bothers you, letting a lie slide to avoid conflict. The trap is that the micro-agreement becomes precedent. Later, when you protest a larger intrusion, the manipulator points backward. You were okay before, you consented before, you didn't mind before. But you didn't consent to the entire staircase. You consented to a single step. Technique 73 is forced familiarity. They act as if intimacy already exists. They use pet names early, they touch casually. They speak about your life as if they have a claim to it. They assume emotional access. They ask questions that imply entitlement. They talk about loyalty before there's trust. Forced familiarity is disorienting because it creates a social dilemma. If you correct them, you risk looking cold. If you accept it, you risk letting someone into a space they haven't earned. The manipulator relies on this discomfort. They know many people would rather feel slightly invaded than risk being seen as rude. Technique 74 is the selective rescue. They help you at the exact moment it binds you. Not because you needed help, but because the help creates dependence. The timing is what matters. When you're vulnerable, when you're tired, when you're ashamed, when you're overwhelmed. They offer solutions that require access. They offer support that requires secrecy. They offer care that comes with terms. The rescue feels like relief. And relief is addictive when you've been stressed for a long time. But later, you'll notice the price. The rescue becomes a debt narrative. The debt becomes obligation. The obligation becomes control. Technique 75 is the competence hook. This is when they flatter your capability in a way that loads responsibility onto you. You're the only one who can handle this. You're the strong one. You're so mature. You're so rational. At first it sounds like respect, but it functions like assignment. You're appointed as the stabilizer, the manager of emotions, the fixer of chaos. And once you accept the role, stepping down feels like betrayal. You're not just refusing a request, you're abandoning an identity. The competence hook is especially effective on conscientious people because it frames exploitation as recognition. Technique 76 is the complicity trap. This is where the manipulator tries to get you to participate, even slightly, in something that violates your values. It might be a small lie, a mild cover story, a secret you keep from someone else, a rule you break just this once, an agreement you make that you wouldn't want documented. The goal is not only the immediate benefit, the goal is shared guilt. Because once you have participated, you become easier to control, not through open threat, but through the quiet fear of exposure. You become reluctant to speak up, reluctant to seek help, reluctant to name what's happening, because you feel you've lost clean hands. And the manipulator understands this. They will often escalate after complicity is established. Technique 77 is private mythology. They tell a story where only the two of you truly understand reality. Everyone else is naive, everyone else is cruel, everyone else is asleep. You and the manipulator are the only ones who see the truth. The relationship becomes a closed narrative. Private mythology is intoxicating because it offers significance. It offers relief from ordinary ambiguity. It creates a sense of belonging that feels like destiny, without using the word. But the cost is isolation. Once you accept the myth, outside feedback becomes suspect by definition. Anyone who questions the dynamic is painted as an enemy of your special bond. Technique 78 is the empathy probe. This is when they test how quickly you will excuse harm if it's paired with vulnerability. They tell you a painful story, they reveal trauma, they describe abandonment, they show tears, or they hint at desperation. Then they do something that crosses a line. Afterward, they watch you. Do you confront? Do you soften? Do you say it's okay? Do you rush to reassure them? Do you become the caretaker? The empathy probe collects data. It tells them whether your compassion can be reliably used to override your boundaries. And to be clear, trauma disclosure can be real. The manipulation isn't the pain. The manipulation is using pain as a permission slip. Now we shift from individual predation into group games. Because once a manipulator has a social field, they can outsource control to the crowd. Technique 79 is the in-group purity test. This is when belonging becomes conditional on adopting the right posture. You must agree with the leader's interpretation. You must dislike the right enemies. You must express loyalty in the approved way. You must perform outrage at the correct targets. You must laugh at the right jokes. Purity tests are rarely about ethics. They're about compliance. They create a constant low-level anxiety. If you disagree, you might be expelled. And when expulsion threatens your identity, you begin self-censoring. Over time, you stop noticing your self-censoring. It feels like maturity. It feels like keeping the peace. It feels like not making drama. Technique 80 is motive laundering. This is when a selfish action is performed through a moral proxy. They don't say, "I want power." They say, "I'm protecting the group." They don't say, "I'm jealous." They say, "I'm concerned." They don't say, "I want revenge." They say, "I want accountability." Motive laundering matters because it makes opposition difficult. If you resist their action, you appear to resist the moral cause attached to it. In group contexts, this tactic is potent. People don't want to be seen as defending harm, so they stay quiet. Silence then looks like consent. Consent then becomes evidence that the action was righteous. Technique 81 is the empathy framing trap. They force you into a false compassion choice. If you enforce your boundary, you're told you're lacking empathy. If you ask for accountability, you're told you're unforgiving. If you name harm, you're told you're weaponizing your feelings. The group learns to treat pain as inconvenient, unless it belongs to the manipulator or the cause. This trap converts empathy into compliance. It teaches you that being a good person means tolerating what shouldn't be tolerated. Technique 82 is social proof fabrication. It doesn't always mean bots or fake accounts. In everyday life, it can be more basic. A manipulator curates reactions. They invite supportive friends into the room. They tell their story first. They choose witnesses who already favor them. They stage moments where they look generous and you look difficult. They also collect phrases. Everyone agrees. Most people think. People are concerned. These vague crowds can be real or implied. Either way, the effect is the same. You feel outnumbered. And when you feel outnumbered, you start negotiating with yourself rather than with the facts. Technique 83 is the controlled leak. This is when information is released strategically to shape perceptions. A screenshot, a partial story, a carefully chosen quote, a confession framed as honesty that conveniently damages you, a rumor dropped with plausible deniability. The leak is designed to create pressure without direct confrontation. The manipulator doesn't have to argue with you. The social field will do it for them. This tactic often appears when the manipulator senses you might speak up. They get ahead of you. They see doubt about your credibility. They create noise so your signal can't land. Technique 84 is the rotating villain. In some groups, there's always a target. When one person leaves or collapses, the group doesn't become peaceful. It selects a new villain. This isn't accidental. A rotating villain stabilizes the hierarchy. It gives the group a sense of unity through shared condemnation. If you ever challenge the leader, you risk becoming the next villain. The rotating villain tactic teaches everyone a lesson. Safety comes from alignment, not from truth. Now we move into containment and recapture. This is what happens when you try to pull away, and the manipulator's goal becomes not connection, but control. Technique 85 is soft surveillance. Not overt spying, necessarily, just a persistent sense that you're being tracked. They notice things you didn't tell them. They reference conversations you had elsewhere. They happen to be in places you go. They keep tabs through mutual friends, through social media, through small questions that seem casual. Soft surveillance is meant to do one thing: make you feel that separation is impossible. When you feel watched, you modify behavior. You shrink. You avoid. You delay leaving. You choose the path of least consequence rather than the path of freedom. Technique 86 is resource tethering. They make it hard for you to live without them. This can be financial dependence, shared accounts, shared housing, shared projects, shared social roles, shared responsibilities that they refuse to take on. It can also be emotional dependence, engineered through isolation. The key is tethering. You can technically leave, but the cost becomes high enough that you hesitate. And during that hesitation, the manipulator continues extracting. Technique 87 is the intermittent peace offer. After conflict, they suddenly become calm, reasonable, gentle. They offer a ceasefire, but the ceasefire comes with conditions. You must drop the issue, you must apologize, you must agree to new terms, you must stop talking to certain people, you must accept their narrative. The peace offer is tempting because your nervous system is exhausted. You want relief. But relief offered as a bargain isn't resolution, it's a reset of control. Technique 88 is the closure meeting trap. They insist on one final conversation to clear the air. This can sound mature, it can sound responsible, it can even be sincere in healthy contexts. But as a tactic, the closure meeting is designed to reopen the loop. They get you alone. They control the framing. They bring emotion. They bring nostalgia. They bring regret. They bring accusations. They bring promises. And because it's positioned as the final moment, you feel pressure to do it correctly, to say the right thing, to end peacefully. That pressure makes you vulnerable to reattachment. The meeting becomes a doorway back into the cycle. Technique 89 is hoovering. This is the attempt to pull you back after you've distanced yourself. It can be kindness, gifts, apologies, sudden insight, declarations of change. It can also be crisis, illness, emergency, confessions, threats. The content varies, but the aim is stable, regain access. Hoovering exploits a basic human ache. You want the story to resolve. You want the person you cared about to be real. You want your investment to mean something. You want to believe the good moments weren't a con. So the manipulator offers just enough to keep hope alive. Technique 90 is the nostalgia weapon. They flood you with memories. They remind you of the beginning, of the intensity, of the private jokes, of the times they showed up. They send old photos. They quote old messages. They speak in a softer voice. Nostalgia is not evidence of change. Nostalgia is an emotional solvent. It dissolves your present clarity by making the past feel more important than the pattern. The weapon isn't the memory. The weapon is the timing. Technique 91 is the exit penalty threat. This can be subtle or overt. If you leave, you'll regret it. If you talk, I'll defend myself. If you try to ruin me, I'll ruin you. If you go, don't expect support. Sometimes it's framed as consequence rather than threat, but the intent is coercion. The manipulator is trying to attach pain to your boundary, so the boundary becomes harder to maintain. Exit penalty threats work best when they connect to what you value: reputation, safety, family, work, belonging. Technique 92 is the hostage asset. They withhold something you need to move on. Documents, property, money, information, access to a shared network, a reference, closure about a situation, even an apology that you crave. They don't always say, "I'm holding this hostage." They just delay, they ignore, they become confusing. They offer partial cooperation that keeps you engaged. The point is tethering again. If you must keep contacting them to retrieve something, they still have a line into your life. Technique 93 is the moral exhaustion campaign. They don't need to convince you they're right. They only need to exhaust you until you stop caring. This can look like endless debate, constant reinterpretation, repeated crises, long messages, long meetings, accusations that require defense, apologies that require processing, new conflicts introduced as soon as the old ones settle. Moral exhaustion is when you lose the internal energy to hold your values in place. You start saying, "Fine," not because you agree, because you're depleted. And depletion can be mistaken for peace. Now we move into the last cluster, existential control. These techniques don't only control your behavior, they attempt to control your meaning. Technique 94 is the redemption narrative. The manipulator tells a story where they are changing, healing, becoming better. They may speak in therapeutic language. They may admit wrongdoing in vague terms. They may emphasize how hard the journey is. They may position you as the person who can finally understand them, finally help them transform. The hook is that you become part of their redemption arc. If you stay, you're compassionate. If you leave, you're abandoning growth. You're giving up on them. You're proving that love is conditional. The redemption narrative is powerful because it recruits your hope as obligation. But change is not a story. Change is behavior over time, under stress, without you having to manage it. Technique 95 is meaning theft. This is when the manipulator appropriates your values, your identity, your language, and then uses it to invalidate you. They speak your words back to you as if they own them. They redefine your ethics to serve their agenda. They claim to represent what you care about more authentically than you do. Meaning theft is disorienting because it makes you feel spiritually or morally displaced, as if your own inner compass has been stolen and used as a prop. You begin to question not only what happened, but who you are allowed to be. Technique 96 is identity foreclosure. They push you toward a narrow self. You are the caretaker. You are the loyal one. You are the calm one. You are the peacemaker. You are the person who understands them. You are the one who doesn't give up. Those identities can be beautiful in healthy contexts, but here they become a cage. Because once you accept the identity, any attempt to expand becomes betrayal. Identity foreclosure is how manipulation becomes a life philosophy. You stop acting from choice. You act from role. Technique 97 is the only I know you claim. They imply that they see the real you and no one else does. Others misunderstand you. Others don't appreciate you. Others are shallow. Others would leave if they knew the real you. The purpose is to isolate you psychologically, even if you're surrounded by people. If you believe only one person truly understands you, that person becomes your mirror. And when your mirror is controlled, your self-image becomes controlled. This is a quiet form of ownership. Technique 98 is the moral inversion vow. They flip ethics. Harm becomes honesty. Cruelty becomes truth. Control becomes protection. Jealousy becomes love. Your boundaries become selfishness. Their demands become needs. Moral inversion is dangerous because it corrupts your language. And language is how you think. If the words are inverted, your mind can't easily map the territory. You start defending yourself for doing normal things. You start apologizing for your own safety. You start feeling guilty for wanting respect. Technique 99 is the grief hijack. As you begin to leave, you grieve. Even when leaving is right, grief is real. The manipulator exploits that grief. They interpret your sadness as proof you should return. They use your longing as evidence that the relationship was meant to be. They show up at moments of vulnerability with softness, offering comfort that blends into recapture. Grief hijack works because grief wants relief. It wants meaning. It wants to go backward. The manipulator offers backward. But grief is not a verdict. Grief is a process. Technique 100 is the final exit maze. This is the last architecture, a confusing, exhausting sequence designed to delay your departure until you either give up or return. Promises of change that require one more chance. Negotiations that never settle. Demands for closure that expand into new arguments. Partial cooperation that keeps you engaged. Threats that keep you vigilant. Guilt that keeps you explaining. The exit maze isn't one tactic. It's a strategy. Keep you in motion without letting you arrive. Because arrival is freedom. And freedom is the one outcome the manipulative system cannot tolerate. So what do you do with a list like this without turning your life into a paranoid audit? You treat these techniques as a language, not a prophecy. You don't need to find all 101 person. You don't need to diagnose. You don't need to win a courtroom in your head. You need to notice one thing. Do your boundaries produce respect, or do they produce retaliation? Because in healthy relationships, boundaries create clarity. In manipulative relationships, boundaries create punishment. That difference is simple enough to remember when you're tired. And this is the final thread running through predation and exit control. Predation selects your vulnerable moments. Containment limits your options. Existential control reshapes your meaning until leaving feels like losing yourself. That's why the work of protection isn't only external, it's internal. It's the work of integration. You rebuild the part of you that trusts your own perception. You rebuild the part of you that doesn't need to earn the right to say no. You rebuild the part of you that can tolerate someone else's disappointment without treating it as emergency. Because the manipulator's deepest advantage was never intelligence. It was your conditioning. And the moment you begin undoing that conditioning, the door doesn't magically unlock. But you stop mistaking the lock for reality. You start hearing the click for what it is. A mechanism. A choice someone made. And a choice you can stop cooperating with, even if you can't dismantle it overnight.
Chapter 18. Protection, the countermoves. After everything we've walked through, it's tempting to turn protection into a kind of mental armor. A constant scan, a permanent suspicion, a life lived with your shoulders slightly raised. But that isn't protection, that's another form of capture. Because if your mind becomes a surveillance camera, you never fully return to yourself. You just replace one pressure with another. Protection, in the real world, is quieter than that. It's not about catching every lie, it's about refusing the conditions that make lies effective. And it starts with a shift that feels simple, but it's the hinge for everything. You stop trying to win inside the manipulator's frame. You stop trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. You stop trying to make your pain legible to someone who uses your pain as a lever. This is what I mean by refusing the game. In a healthy relationship, clarification leads to clarity, accountability leads to repair, boundaries lead to respect, even if they're inconvenient. Conflict leads somewhere. In a manipulative system, conflict is not a problem to be solved. It is a tool. It is a treadmill that keeps you tired and engaged. So the first countermove is recognizing the treadmill. You can feel it when the topic keeps sliding. You can feel it when your calm, concrete statements are met with fog. You can feel it when every attempt at resolution creates a new accusation. You can feel it when you leave a conversation, not clearer but smaller. Refusing the game doesn't mean you become cruel. It means you become brief. You stop offering endless explanation as a form of peacekeeping. You stop debating your right to have a boundary. You stop negotiating with guilt that has no remedy. You stop trying to prove your reality to someone committed to contesting it. You can still be respectful, you can still be human, but you stop feeding the loop. Now that sounds decisive, but it isn't always easy in the moment, because your nervous system may have been trained to treat conflict as danger. So protection isn't only about what you say. It's about stabilizing the part of you that can hold steady when the other person escalates. That brings us to reality anchors. If manipulation thrives on isolating events, making each incident feel like it happened in a vacuum, then your countermove is to connect events back into pattern. And there are 3 practical anchors that do that without turning you into a detective. The first is documentation. Not as revenge, not as obsession, as memory support. Because when you're stressed, memory becomes vulnerable. Not because you're weak, but because the brain prioritizes survival, not record-keeping. And a manipulative person counts on that. They count on your fatigue. They count on your desire to move on. They count on your hope. So you write things down privately. What was said, what was asked, what changed, what you agreed to and what you didn't, what the consequence was. You don't need to capture every detail. You're not building a court case. You're protecting your future self from rule fog. And the act of writing also does something subtle. It restores your authority as a narrator. It tells your mind, quietly, I'm allowed to know what happened. The second anchor is a trusted witness. Not a crowd, not a smear campaign. A person with enough steadiness to reflect reality back to you. Manipulation works best when you are the only mirror. When your perception is the only thing that can be attacked. When every doubt has nowhere to go but inward. A trusted witness breaks that. It might be a close friend you can talk to without being judged. It might be a therapist. It might be a mentor. It might be a colleague outside the immediate chain of influence. The function of the witness isn't to tell you what to do. It's to restore a shared reality. Because once you remember that reality can be shared, you stop treating the manipulator as your only interpreter, and that alone reduces their power. The third anchor is routine. This one sounds almost too ordinary to matter, but it matters because manipulation often erodes the small structures that keep you coherent. Your sleep, your meals, your quiet time, your movement, your work rhythms, your time with people who don't demand performance. Routine is not just self-care. It is identity maintenance. When your routine collapses, your choices start coming from depletion, and depletion is one of the main currencies manipulators spend. So you return to rhythm as protection. You don't wait until you feel better. You do it because it restores the part of you that can think clearly. Now let's talk about distance. This is the part people resist, because distance sounds harsh, it sounds like abandonment, it sounds like overreaction. It sounds like losing something. But clarity often requires distance, for a simple reason. You can't see a fog system while you're still breathing it. When you are in constant contact, constant texts, constant explanations, constant emotional temperature checks, your nervous system stays activated. And in activation, your mind becomes vulnerable to the oldest trade you can make. You exchange truth for relief. Distance interrupts that trade. Distance gives your body a baseline again. That baseline becomes your new reference point. You start noticing something you didn't have access to while you were inside the cycle, how you feel when the pressure isn't present. Some people discover they can finally sleep, or breathe, or eat, or think, or laugh without monitoring the room. And that information is not small. It's diagnostic. Because one of the simplest measures of a relationship's health is this: do you become more yourself over time, or less? Distance doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it starts as delayed responses. Sometimes it starts as fewer meetings. Sometimes it starts as moving certain conversations into writing. Sometimes it starts as not answering late-night messages. Sometimes it starts as refusing to be alone with someone who uses privacy as cover. Sometimes distance is physical separation, and sometimes it's emotional separation, refusing to take responsibility for someone else's reactions. And that brings us to a core countermove that's hard to practice but simple to understand. You stop treating their disappointment as emergency. A manipulator often uses intensity to train you. Their anger becomes a threat. Their sadness becomes a trap. Their silence becomes punishment. Their collapse becomes your responsibility. Protection means you allow their feelings to exist without letting those feelings dictate your choices. This is not cruelty. This is differentiation. You can care about someone without becoming governed by them. You can empathize with their pain without surrendering your reality. You can feel guilt without treating guilt as proof you've done something wrong. And if you've been conditioned by fog, fear, obligation, guilt, this is where your freedom begins. Because you start discovering that discomfort is survivable. You can survive someone being unhappy with you. You can survive being misunderstood. You can survive not fixing the mood in the room. And once you can survive that, the manipulator loses one of their strongest tools, your reflex to repair at any cost. Now there's a final counter move that ties everything together. You stop trying to outmaneuver the manipulator. You don't need to become a better strategist than they are. That's still the game. Instead, you become a person who doesn't offer the kind of access their tactics require. You don't make big decisions under urgency. You don't accept vague accusations without specifics. You don't stay in conversations that punish clarity. You don't keep secrets that isolate you. You don't trade your sleep for someone else's emotional demand. You don't negotiate your boundaries through guilt. And when you do speak, you speak with a different aim. Not to convince. To declare. A boundary isn't an argument, it's an exit sign. This is where protection becomes less about psychology and more about integration. The work of integration is when you stop outsourcing your worth to someone else's approval. It's when you stop needing permission to trust your own perception. It's when you stop treating your needs as crimes that require defense. Because the deepest injury manipulation creates isn't just what you lost. It's the internal habit of self-doubt. And the deepest protection is not a perfect detection system. It's a restored relationship with yourself. You begin to notice the first moment your body tenses, and you don't override it. You begin to hear the first perimeter test, and you respond cleanly. You begin to feel the urge to explain, and you choose brevity instead. You begin to feel the pull of nostalgia, and you return to the pattern. You begin to feel the urge to rescue, and you ask whether rescue creates dependence. And slowly you stop living as if every relationship is a trial you must pass. You start living as if your mind is allowed to be yours. Because that's the quiet truth at the end of all this. Dark Triad dynamics rely on access. Access to your time. Access to your attention. Access to your identity. Access to your guilt. Access to your hope. Protection is the decision to limit that access. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. And once you choose clarity, distance becomes less like loss. It becomes the space where you can hear your own mind again. Conclusion: choosing clarity in the quiet hours. Clarity usually arrives when nothing is happening. No argument in progress, no apology on the table, no urgent message demanding a reply. Just you, alone, noticing how your body feels when the pressure isn't there. That's often where the mask finally cracks, not because you gathered more evidence, but because you stopped living inside their weather. If you take one thing from this entire journey, let it be this: you don't protect yourself by winning debates with a manipulator. You protect yourself by responding to patterns with structure. You choose sleep over late-night chaos. You choose documentation over fog. You choose witnesses over isolation. You choose distance over negotiation with someone who punishes clarity. And when you do that, the real change is quiet. You stop performing your reality for approval. You stop trying to rescue someone who uses rescue as a leash. You stop treating guilt as a command. You start treating your nervous system as a reliable instrument again. If you want to keep going, subscribe for more deep dives into the psyche and the work of integration. And if you want tools you can actually use, check the description for the Forbidden Mindset PDF, the Shadow Work Journal, and the Shadow Mind Toolkit links. Now choose clarity. Then choose distance.